OEIB Higher Education Coordinating Commission meeting. Seth, if you would call the roll.
Governor Kitzhofer.
Here.
Julia Britt Edwards. Yvonne Curtis.
Here.
Present. That was Julia. Sorry.
Thank you. Matthew Donegan. Samuel Henry.
Here.
Nicole June Maher.
Here.
Mark Mulvihill.
Here.
David Reeves.
Here.
Ron Saxton. Mary Spildy.
Here.
Kay Turan.
Here.
Hannah Vandering.
Here.
Dick Whitnell.
On the phone.
Great. We have a quorum. First action item would be to approve the minutes for the February board meeting.
So moved. Second.
Motion and a second to approve the minutes from the February board meeting. Is there discussion or objection? For those who came late, just before this meeting, we signed two pieces of legislation to support improved access to community colleges. The first one was House Bill 4116 that appropriated $750,000 for underserved students. And the second was Senate Bill 1524 that directs the Higher Education Coordinating Commission to study the feasibility of providing community college tuition to all Oregon high school graduates. And by design, we signed those bills before this particular meeting because, as I just mentioned, we are meeting jointly as the OEIB and the HEC. And I'm very excited about the meeting and the discussion topics that we've got on the agenda today because I think they highlight the critical need to focus on post-secondary access. Ideally, also, the seamless system that we're trying to put together here has enough space to discuss the importance of aligning our education system with our workforce system. And we've got Agnes Velasa here, my Senior Policy Advisor on Workforce, who will be coming up later to highlight the work we're about to embark on between the Workforce Investment Board and the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. She and Ben Cannon, the Executive Director of the HEC, will also present a policy paper for you to consider that gives more definition to the term middle 40. Very, very, very important, particularly for this group. We'll also hear the strategic plan of the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. We'll hear from a group from the Portland City Club that's focusing on disconnected youth and the potential opportunities for the new GED. And then an initial discussion of college and career readiness. I'm very encouraged by your work on and your commitment to improved system of alignment and strategies that ensure student success. And I also want to continue to recommend that both the OEIB and the HEC consider these key connections in light of budget recommendations that you might make. As we shift our focus going into the next budget cycle to budget development and funding, I think it's very, very important that we do all we can to make data-driven budget decisions. And I think it's very important that we remain committed to creating a budget framework that rewards innovation and strategies that promote student achievement. The investments that we put in the budget need to reflect our priorities and our values, and they need to be linked to student success and student outcomes. As we hear back from the OEIB's subcommittee on outcome investments and their investment policy framework that they'll present to us, I think it's important that we never forget why we're here. To me, there's three basic reasons. One, a commitment to do everything possible we can to advance student achievement, student attainment, and student success. Secondly, our responsibility to develop a budget, a set of recommendations that reward coordination and alignment and advance student outcomes. And finally, I hope a commitment that our investment strategy will not simply sustain the current system, but will actually transform it in ways that are significant to achieve our 40-40-20 objective. So it's just great to be here, kind of an historic meeting, two newly minted boards that have an awesome set of responsibilities and a very large portfolio. No one better able to handle that portfolio than our Chief Education Officer, Nancy Bolton.
Thank you. I think this is historic too, so thank you. I'm very excited about today. I want you to know that we have been talking to the field about the Achievement Compact. We know that the Achievement Compact articulates those outcomes we need for our students to move seamlessly along the system for us to budget to, and so we are getting input from the field because we want those achievement compacts to really matter and really guide the work. So Do know at the next OEIB meeting, we will be bringing back recommendations based on the input that we got around the Achievement Compact. We're focused on one of our key transitions, which is from high school to post-secondary. So that's exciting, but I want to have Mark talk about an event that's around that very important third grade reading benchmark. And Mark, if you want, where are you? There you are. If you want to just tell a little bit about the meeting we had, the outcome we were looking for, and what you saw, that'd be great.
Remind me again, Nancy, with that.
This is about the meeting we had and what Warren Springs that you wanted to.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect a little bit upon that we had the state summit, and I know that was put together. Many people attended that meeting on the diversity. And it was really an event I think we all took something away from. One of those meetings that you really didn't realize the impact until a few days later when you had process time. But really what was stunning was the data that just came out, which as a former elementary principal, I was stunned at this, on just the performance of our students of color, where right now, statistically in Oregon, we have students, our kids, our white population that is economically disadvantaged is still performing at levels higher than our students of color that aren't economically disadvantaged. That was pretty humbling for me to really take a look at the data and see what our challenges are that are ahead of us, that poverty isn't just the issue that we have to face in getting our kids to 40-40-20. But the overall conference was just excellent in that it incorporated folks from all over Oregon that are really vested in this effort, looking at third grade reading, which is our #1 return on investment, which includes everything from the prenatal to the third grade. But just seeing the diversity in the room and the people committed, whether it's in the education sector, nonprofits, whatnot, it was really a compelling event, and I would encourage Nancy that we look at continuing events like that.
I think what was really key is that we brought together organizations, nonprofit, and public schools who are getting results. And we tried to put the people in the room who reflect the cultures of the children and really talk about if we really want to close that achievement gap, what is working, what do we need to make sure we include in our model. So it's the first of a continuing conversation and a historic moment too, I think.
Governor and Nancy, I'd like for someone to take a look at what's happening in New York City with the Success Academy. It's a charter school where there's this controversy about the new mayors and the charter schools can't have free space in the public school. But they've been following and tracking these students who are African American, low income, come from Harlem. In the last math test, they scored the highest in the state of New York. I think we want to look and see what they are doing and what kind of learnings are there for us that maybe we could transport that to the world.
Thank you. I'll do that.
Okay, Agnes. Seems like you're a long way back there.
It felt like a long way back there. Members of the board, I'm Agnes Velasco, the Governor's Policy Advisor for Workforce, and I've been invited here today to say a few words about an effort to create greater alignment at the post-secondary level between our workforce and education efforts, specifically the formation of a joint committee between the Higher Education Coordinating Commission and the Oregon Workforce Investment Board. In your packets, you have a copy of the letter that Governor Kitzhaber forwarded to the chairs of the committees as well. I think you do. Sorry, I don't have a full packet for me. As well as the draft charter of this work group. This effort came about as the result of a conversation we had with the community colleges as we were trying to better identify their role both in education and in workforce development. It was a request that we spend some concentrated time focused on policy questions related to what is shared space between these two boards. The HEC, which is explicitly responsible for the achievement of the Middle 40 goals, and the Oregon Workforce Investment Board, whose job it is to better align the supply and demand of skilled workers with the needs of industry. And so the joint committee that will form is really a task force. It has a limited time duration, a sunset, during which time it will develop a set of recommendations specifically around those topics and a recommendation on how to carry forward the work after the task force dissolves. Specific topics include shared outcomes and how the responsibility for those shared outcomes would be managed, what the relationship between the two boards looks like, and how that will be managed, where there's shared policy-making space that requires joint approvals and clarification of roles and responsibilities between the two organizations for assuring that we meet both our goals for a highly skilled workforce and a highly educated workforce. The chairs of the two committees, Chair Nesbitt here and Ken Madden of the Oregon Workforce Investment Board, will be meeting with staff later this week to finalize the actual set of activities and the final membership of the committee, which will meet in conjunction with Higher Education Permitting Commission meetings for 4 weeks between now and September, with a final report to come out by September 30th.
Questions for Dennis, comments? Okay, putting us ahead of schedule. Ben, why don't you come up and join us?
I'm seldom so concise.
We're clear, no questions.
Thank you, Governor Kitzhaber, members of both boards. Ben Cannon, Executive Director for the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And we're returning with the next agenda item to the question of better defining and refining our 40-40-20 rule. I'll direct the board's attention to, first, recollection to the paper that you reviewed that I prepared with input from a number of others, including Agnes, that suggested the direction of these proposed refinements. You reviewed that and we had some discussion of it at the OEIB meeting in January. In your packets is a draft policy statement for your consideration that you may decide to take up in your April meeting, but we'd appreciate your feedback on, questions about, requests for additional information about before your potential adoption of these refinements as soon as April. The draft policy statement is really a distillation of that larger paper, and as you'll recall, we attempted in that paper to better define to whom 40-40-20 applies and what counts, particularly in the middle 40. My role here is really just to tee up the discussion. You'll hear from Agnes Balassa and Shali Hodgson from CCWB with more on the kind of proposal around the middle 40 definition. And then we've also asked Senator Hess and Representative Reed to reflect, given their role in the origination of 40-40-20, reflect on the goal as well as these potentially these refinements. Very briefly on the policy statement, again, I hope you have located this in your packets, draft OEIB policy statement on refining 40-40-20. We've proposed that you take up the question of to whom it applies and answer that by saying, first of all, that it applies equally to all Oregonians, and we call out in particular here, using language from your equity lens, we call out here that ensuring that communities of color, immigrants, migrants, and low-income rural students are as well represented as more affluent white students at each stage of completion. So really clarifying a policy I think you've already essentially adopted, but putting that right out front and center. And then this vexing question of age cohorts. This statement speaks to the conversation we had in January where we bifurcated the goal to some extent and said that 40-40-20 applies to the pipeline, that it is our goal for the high school classes of 2025 and beyond as it's expressed, 40-40-20. But it also has an application for the adult working population. That goal, when we're talking about the adult working population, is one that needs to be calibrated and recalibrated over time in alignment with labor force needs and projections around labor market demands as well as other factors. And then in terms of middle 40, I think really I'll save that for Agnes and Shali, but we propose here in this policy statement the broad understanding of what counts for the middle 40 that they'll have more to say about. Finally, on the back side of the policy statement is a sort of separate request from the OEIB to the HEC and the OEIB in conjunction with CCWD and the Department of Employment to report back to you, the OEIB, on additional development around the initial goals for the working age adult population. If it's not precisely 40-40-20, then what is it when we're talking about that population in the short term and the medium term? And then recommendations for further articulation of the degrees, certificates, and other credentials that could constitute the Middle 40. I think some of this work can be done via the HEC the task force that Agnes described and the governor created. So I think I'll stop there, and I believe you and Shelley have a presentation.
Yes, we have a PowerPoint. Thank you.
Governor Wall, just a quick question. Ben, when do you foresee us hearing back from this work group?
Governor, Dr. Henry, the HEC OEIB task force that will deal with some portions of this question is returning to their respective groups and the OEIB, I believe, in September, so the time period over which the HEC OEIB task force is meant to do its work. And so I think these sort of what next steps, we've called out the September 30th date for reporting back to the OEIB.
Okay, thank you.
And just to clarify, it would be possible for us to report along the way as there are major decision points that may need additional vetting.
Ben, I just want to comment, I think that's great that you're really defining the middle 40 in a much more concise way. One thing, just an ask, and I'm hearing a lot of traction on this National Career Readiness Certificate as well as badges. It would be helpful as you message this, if all those options were available for folks.
And I think
probably getting your PowerPoint.
I think you'll hear about those in the conversation as well.
Yeah. So we had not specifically planned on discussing the National Career Readiness Certificate, but we can bring it into the conversation. It's a little bit different than some of the other things we're talking about, but definitely important to the discussion. So with that, I'd like to introduce Shelley Hodson from Department of Community Colleges and Workforce Development. We could not have put together this presentation without Shelley, and even though I'm going to be doing a large amount of the talking, she is the technical expert and will be here to keep me from looking foolish by answering questions incorrectly. Essentially, part of the reason that I'm the one doing this presentation today is because this conversation of what counts for the Middle 40 really is very critical to this intersection between workforce and education. If we think about our 40-40-20 goals not as a set of numeric targets, but rather as an attempt to assure that we can have a better future based on the skills and talents of our youth and our adult population, able to create new solutions to our ongoing nagging problems, our ecological problems, our economical problems, our social problems, by having the skills to really dig in and try to come up with better solutions. Then what we have also is an opportunity for those individuals to make a good living based on those skills and talents. And so the Middle 40 is a key place for that discussion because it is a place where we see not only students in a pipeline trying to get the first 2 years of a 4-year education or beyond, but we also have a large number of working adults, some with advanced degrees, some without. In many cases, minorities who have earned the first post-secondary credentials in their family's history. In other cases, immigrant populations and others who use the Middle 40 as an opportunity to move ahead and engage on their next steps, and not only thinking about their educational future, but also about how to parlay that into workforce success. And so, moving on to the first slide. Get that work. When you look at what the legislation says about the Middle 40, it leaves the definition fairly broad and fairly open. It talks about ensuring that at least 40% of adult Oregonians had earned an associate's degree or post-secondary credential as their highest level of educational attainment. However, when you look at what we are currently counting for that Middle 40, we're focusing this primarily on what community colleges are able to offer in terms of associate's degrees and certificates of completion. What's important to note about associate's degrees and certificates of completion is that there's a fair amount of rigor here to these, as well as a fair amount of customization based on community needs. These are state approved as well as approved by local college boards. They have credits associated with them. They are part of a pathway. We'll just take a minute to talk about the difference between these. This was a learning for me as I spent more time with Shali and others at CCWD trying to better understand what's in that pot. Associate's degrees do have some variability. They go from 90 to 108 credits. Some of them transfer, some of them do not. Most students earn them anywhere from 2 years to a little bit longer in terms of how much time it takes for them to get all the way through. But there's a huge number of degrees count as associate's degrees, not just the transfer of arts, but also general studies, sciences, transfers of business, etc. The other piece of this puzzle are certificates of completion, which have great variability. They go anywhere from 12 to 108 credits, anywhere from 1 term to 2 years, and you can see a variety of those listed here. One of the important things to remember about the certificates of completion is the high level of customization that's there. Where very often the number of credits, etc., are based on industry needs or other types of factors that allow them to customize. Most of these do not transfer, although there are stackable ones in terms of the career pathways certificates that are listed on here. These are also credit-bearing tools. And so when we talk about what else might be included in our definition of the middle 40, as you saw, the legislative definition speaks broadly. It does not state specifically that only credit-bearing tools can be used for this process. More and more, as we're looking at census data, this comes out of the census as common, more and more as we're looking at the research about degrees and certifications in particular, what we're starting to see is the importance of talking about both those educational certifications that we've talked about, but other professional certifications, licenses, etc., that are part of the mix. And when you talk with industry, they will often talk about licenses and industry-recognized certifications as part of what they're looking for to find a skilled employee. And so what counts? Before I go into what counts, I want to call attention to a study from Georgetown that was conducted a few years back where they were looking at the certification marketplace. And one of the things that's really interesting about the certifications we talk about is we actually talk about them as a marketplace. Because there is rapid growth, because people can pick and choose which products they want to purchase and which products they want to honor as employers. Because you have a variety of vendors that provide these products, some of them accredited institutions, some of them industry associations, some of them state licensing bureaus, and it's a place right now where there's a lot of change, a lot of energy, and we'll talk a little bit about the fact that it's also a disruptive place and that it's challenging some of our assumptions about how people get from point A to point B. The Georgetown study showed very clearly that certifications are especially useful in helping those with barriers to employment move forward, individuals who have been long-term unemployed, veterans who don't have formal documentation of what they may have learned on the job, immigrants, those even without high school diplomas who can sometimes earn a certificate even if they have not completed the first level of education. So it's an interesting marketplace. There's a lot going on in it. We lumped them, for the sake of discussion, into 3 categories: industry-recognized certifications. These are administered by a third party and require some form of validation. Typically, they're also time-limited. We just spent the last 2 weeks with the president of the Manufacturing Institute, which is a national institute that has identified a handful of certifications across manufacturing industries that they say count for moving people across career paths. The next piece is licenses. These are awarded by state-recognized entities. You frequently hear about them in the medical field, accounting, etc. So you should be familiar with that kind of piece. And then apprenticeship, which was added to the definition of the middle 40 by a recent piece of legislation, which I believe further supports that the legislature had intended a fairly broad definition of what we meant by the middle 40. Just for interest, one of the big trends that we're seeing is a growing demand for competency-based credentials. Gallup and Lumina you may know as a foundation that has spent a lot of time investing in education and educational advancement, conducted a poll not long ago that indicated that many students talk about the ability to receive college credit for knowledge and skills acquired outside the classroom, would enroll in higher education if they could receive credit for what they already know. Some certifications do that. 75% say learning should not be time-based. 75% that say that students have mastered class materials in less than 16 weeks. They should get credit without having to sit. And we're seeing this in some programs where students actually are able to earn the certification at 3/4 of the way through a course, and are often hired before they're actually all the way through it. This is one way to capture that learning and be able to continue to articulate it into next steps. So what are the opportunities? One of the things that the certifications do is provide us, and the licensures, is provide us the opportunity to better align what happens in terms of curriculum with what happens within what is needed by industry, because it's an explicit description of what's needed. It also helps job seekers better describe their skills to employers. In terms of better aligning the middle 40 with labor market demands, this is a place where we have the opportunity to create some alignment, identifying pools of certified workers, and you can see this piece about acceleration of credential attainment, increasing worker competitiveness and wage gains. Because they're not necessarily time-based, they're competency-based in many cases, it allows people to accelerate the time it takes to get to the end. So some of the challenges. Right now, one of the big challenges is the lack of collaboration between the certifying entities and post-secondary institutions, and the fact that it's often hard for us to track on these. If you all as an entity agree to an expanded definition, one of the things that will have to be done administratively is figuring out the mechanisms to actually document where those certifications are earned and to discuss how those would flow into our 40-40-20 goals. It's difficult to know if students completing post-secondary programs are well prepared to meet industry-specified competencies. The marketplace is currently completely unregulated, and that's one of the reasons we want to have this conversation sooner rather than later. Because there's an opportunity for our education and workforce systems to draw some lines in the sand about what is a quality certificate, what really should count, in the sense that not every certificate is created equal. Not every certificate fits every purpose. In the paper that Ben had mentioned, one of the recommendations was that we look at rigor in terms of third-party validation or being issued by an accredited institution. But at some point, a list will have to be developed of what counts and what doesn't. And as we're having our conversation between the Workforce Investment Board and the HEC, there's an opportunity there to clarify our expectations of what we really mean by that. And in fact, it's a disruptive force in the way we currently issue education. Because it's not seat-based, because it's not necessarily credit-based, there's a lot of questions it creates about how do we articulate these into next steps. Can you take a credential that's issued and recognized by a third party and turn that into some form of credit? The National Career Readiness Certificate is an example of one place where that work is already happening. While the National Career Readiness Certificate is a certification of foundational skills, not technical skills, and what we're talking about here are more the technical skills, it can be used as part of the completion of a high school diploma. It articulates to the competencies there and can be used as one of the tools for somebody to graduate from high school. And also the ACE,
American Council on Education.
The American Council on Education has specified guidelines by which college credit can be awarded to somebody who earns a National Career Readiness Certificate. So some of this is happening already. The question, I think, for all of us is how do we get ahead of it so that it meets our needs and fulfills what we're trying to achieve for Oregonians. And so with that, oops. Okay, I don't know why I did that. Wow, it's the PowerPoint. I'm sure it's something in the PowerPoint.
Can you make it color?
Yeah, it's not you. I'm sure it's me. And so with that, part of the work that CCW is doing, I'm going to ask Charlie to talk about, is joining with a coalition of 20 other states to discuss these topics related to this field of credentialing.
So, as you can imagine, Oregon is not the only state grappling with these issues and how to integrate some of these types of credentials into what counts. And so we are working with, as I just mentioned, 20 other states led by California and North Carolina to talk about what a credentialing system might look like nationwide, how we would track it, what data sharing agreements would need to be in place, sort of the nitty-gritty details on how that could work. And so I've had a couple of phone calls with those folks, and we're having an in-person meeting in April to start talking about what that could look like. So moving it forward both here at home and nationally.
And so you'll see I left Shali's contact information on the last slide because she really is the one who has been working on this at the ground level to make sure that we all have the knowledge and information we need to be well informed on this topic. And so with that, I will stop here. I think the question for you is, as Ben has laid out, around next steps and the possibility of adopting policy that clarifies an interest in expanding and broadening how we count that middle 40. And looking potentially at some additional factors to figure out how that would apply to an adult population that is not necessarily part of the pipeline, so that we can set some goals both for our workforce system that engages unemployed individuals looking for work, as well as for those who have already identified themselves as students wanting to move forward.
Forgive me if this is out of term, but there seems to be a segment of the population you mentioned very briefly about veterans. And we seem to be at a point in time when there are likely to be more veterans returning to the workforce. Is it possible as we go forward to have a little bit more depth in terms of what's happening with respect to that, particularly in our collaborations with the other 20 states, so that we have a fuller picture of that?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I was pretty excited yesterday to hear a presentation from Cam Price in Blue Mountain yesterday talking about the certificate. And one of the things, and I need a little help here with this to make sure I'm clear in my understanding, was that the work keys component of the certificate is another alternative for students with the essential skills component for graduation. I think that's a game changer opportunity. As you know, high schools are struggling and right in the middle of meeting those, the graduation requirements that have really become quite rigorous in Oregon. To me, this is a perfect opportunity to mold grades 11 through 14 together in this avenue as well.
I see Duncan smiling because that's always been one of his hopes.
This was a policy the board, Samuel, the state board adopted, what was this, 3 or 4 years ago, as one of the ways to document essential skills, we did a career readiness certificate. I think the goal of them. So yeah, it's already in place.
It only took 4 years to hear that.
Yeah.
It's already in place. It's taken a while for high schools to request it as an option. Because they do have other options. It's one of several options for proving the essential skills. But what's nice about it is when a student earns a National Career Readiness Certificate, they've documented 2 of their essential skills, and they have a 3rd test that gives them a nationally recognized certification that shows that they can not only read, but can apply reading. They can not only do math, but apply math. And they have skills in locating information. And when you think about how our world functions, all of us are working off of screens, like the ones you have in front of you. Locating information becomes more and more critical as time goes on as a way to be able to interface with our world. And the fact now that we're working on trying to figure out how to articulate that into some credit as well, as colleges decide how they want to move forward with that, creates another opportunity to have a credit-bearing tool as well engaged in all that. So it's a really nice little package.
So 2 points, I guess. One is a question. So there's at least 2 big challenges. One of them we've focused on, which is really a data collection, data sharing challenge, and making sure we're not reinventing the wheel. And the coalition of the 20 states addresses that. I guess the other question, this is a question that community colleges and maybe you. It seems to me that our current funding architecture and funding formulas have some inherent disincentives to do this. And so it seems to me that it would be important for us at least to get that on the table so that we're talking about it and trying to figure out a way forward. Because to go down the road and pretend that isn't going to happen is a little naive. And so, not prejudging what the solution is, but we should, I think intentionally about where those rub points are going to be and build a strategy to start discussing and how we move past them.
I think that's it.
Anything else for this great panel? All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't we have, we've got Senator Hasker, Senator Reed. Do you guys want to come up and add anything to this conversation here before we kick it back to Chair Hasker?
Governor, everyone, for an awful lot of college credits represented around. Just a very quick reflection on the 40-40-20 rule. It was passed in the 2011 session of the Senate Bill 253. It was part of a package of bills that came about most notably with the Senate Bill 248, which was the restructuring of our higher education system that did two things. It changed our public universities from state agencies to public universities, and it created the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And in that package, there was another bill that took a step forward in dual credits, and this all came about in a task force a year before. And Representative Reed and I thought, you know, it's a shame, somewhere in there should be the 40-40-20 goal into state law somehow. We thought about putting it in these other bills, but decided to keep it as a standalone bill. And as it went through, there was some criticism of it that it wasn't going to do anything. It was just aspirational. There was no money attached, and that was true. And there was no money attached to it. But I've marveled at how in the last 2 years that in addition to being a goal for this state, it has become something of an attitude. In that 40-40-20 permeates almost every discussion I have with educators, community colleges, K through 12, about what we need to do. And already there are actions that have been taken at the school district level, at community colleges, looking at struggling students in universities, saying, you know, you may have enough to qualify for an associate's degree. Looking at veterans, say you might be able to transfer some of those credits without even being asked. And I think that's the beauty here. And I know we've got a long ways to go, but this attitude has just, like I said, just marveled at what this rallying cry is. And so that's kind of the impetus that was there at the beginning. We worked with national experts on the reorganization bill, and we asked them about this, and they said, boy, it's pretty ambitious. No other state has this. And that was all the encouragement we needed to push forward. So that's what we have. I remember when we first had it drafted, the legislative council came back and I looked at the bill and said there was a sentence about 80% of the workforce should have some college level experience in it defined. And I went back down and I said, you know, it's you're saying 80% instead of 40-40. He goes, well, you don't want to be redundant. He's a lawyer.
So why don't you look over your left shoulder?
And so I said, you know, you're right, but there was just something about 40-40-20 that's got a cadence. It's like 2-4-6-8. And so they reluctantly changed it, and I'm glad they did. And so that's how we got here.
Governor, committee members, I'm Tobias Reed from Beaverton. You ever follow a tough act? This is one of those opportunities for me. One of the reasons that 40-40-20 happened as it did, as Senator Haas said, is that we had his assistance as the marketing pro that he is. So I'm just glad that you're all willing to let us be in the room with you. I think we played a role in creating a large challenge for the state, and I'm thrilled that you all are willing to help take it up. There isn't a lot of new content that I can add to what Senator Haas said, but I want to make a couple of points. The first is just how pleased I am that you're getting down to those details and how it's going to actually work. When I was in graduate school, I had a managerial accounting professor who did a really wonderful thing at the end of our term together. He gave us all a laminated 8.5 by 11 sheet, two-sided, with all the things that we had to remember. But he said, even if you can't remember that, if I see you at a cocktail party or something, you just have to remember two things, and I'll consider the class a success. He said, incremental analysis, and you get what you measure. So I think that was a good summary for me, and it's part of what motivates me to think about 40-40-20. It's something that's memorable, it's something that works for us as legislators to talk to our constituents. People understand that that's a place we're trying to go. And I wouldn't pretend to have the expertise that's assembled here or to contradict or really add much to what Shalee and Agnes have already added. But I was struck by something in the paper in their presentation that I think there's a tension between sort of describing where we want to go and what we want for the state, between what is needed for the economy as it exists, as it will be, and in the task that I think we all have in sort of in equipping successful citizens to navigate a changing world. So I know you're wrestling with that, and I hope you'll keep it in mind. The other thing is just, as all of you who've been involved in this know, things change. So I appreciate the flexibility that's evident here, and that I hope is clear in our intention. We want you to wrestle with it and let us know when it would be helpful and when statute ought to change. So thanks for all your work. Thanks for sticking at it.
Great, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have Tim Nesbitt and company discuss the, yep, sorry, yeah.
Just process the draft policy statement. So we have that, and what's being asked is that we review this and then put it into action at the next meeting. Is that, I just want to make sure that I understand.
Yes, I don't believe there's any action because we just to review it.
Okay.
Right, we're trying to do 2 meetings before we do actions, first readings and second.
Okay. So will we have a discussion on this at the next meeting? I just want to, I'm going to have a conversation offline with Ben, I guess, about this prior to that meeting, of course.
Okay.
Good afternoon. It's great to be back with the board, and on behalf of my fellow commissioners, we're happy to be joining you for our first joint meeting. We have had a busy first 6 months with the new members of the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, and completed this morning an action plan for the remainder of the biennium, informed by a strategy for steering, cheering, and persevering to achieve those 40-40-20 goals we've been discussing. Governor, as you know, those are your North Star and our guideposts for the mission for the head, with our focus being on the first and second 40 and the 40 for post-secondary completion. Again, it's not that our mission is defined by those numbers or the gaps we'll be talking about, but those are the guideposts for us in achieving the kind of educational attainment which all the data shows us is essential for individual opportunity and economic progress. So one set of data you're looking at here shows the ascending income expectations for individuals as they attain post-secondary education and 2-year and 4-year and postgraduate degrees. Obviously, the higher the level of attainment, the greater the likelihood of higher incomes, as well as civic and social progress. We have been looking at the gaps in those first 2 slots, the 40 and 40, for some time now. But we are sharpening our understanding of what it means to close those gaps, of who's represented within the populations to be served. We hope to achieve those 40 and 40 post-secondary goals. We will be discussing more of the challenges we see ahead of us, and at this point, I want to step back and let Executive Director Ben Cannon guide us through the new governance landscape and what we see as our responsibilities and the tools at our disposal to carry this work forward.
So you're looking at a not new, but in some ways still, I think to many of us, so new organizational design. We're of course focused on the right-hand side of this chart, which defines and helps define the role of the OEIB and the HEC as being the sole coordinating entities for our higher education system. So with the transitions underway for the State Board of Higher Education, along with institutional boards at PSU, UVO, and OSU, an important reminder here that it is, from the state standpoint, it is the OEIB and the HEC that are solely responsible for coordination within our higher education system. The HEC's authorities, which we'll be talking a little bit more about in a few minutes, include approving new academic programs, approving missions for public universities, allocating funding to community colleges and public universities, etc. This chart would be more accurate in the spirit of this work if the institutions on the lower side and their governing boards were on one side of the page and the state boards and commissions, the OEIB and the HEC on the other, in a side-by-side relationship, not a top-down. This defines or attempts to depict some of what's new about the structure, and with particular emphasis on what's changed for public universities. The old paradigm here is one that applied more to the management of our public university system and is shifting to reflect the new paradigm. And I'll walk through these quickly, and I think this is partly to try to answer the question of, well, what's different about what we're talking about here than previous efforts the state may have made in the past around higher education. Arguably, under the old paradigm, the public system was managed to sustain existing institutions. The role of the State Board of Higher Ed was to govern and to sustain its public universities. Under the new paradigm, OEIB and HEC-led, the public system is organized to maximize student success. We are intentionally agnostic with respect to institutions. We're not at all agnostic with respect to student outcomes. Under the old paradigm, arguably, the state budgeting constraints encouraged cost shifting in a pretty opaque way to institutions and to students, or back and forth between them. And so, for example, as state budgets decline, and you'll see this in a moment, tuition costs increased significantly, and that occurred, and I think people like you understood that. I think generally speaking that was not presented clearly, and part of our role is to clarify the impacts of state budgeting constraints on institutions and students. Historically, the state has provided resources to community colleges and public universities, primarily on the basis of student enrollment. Under the governor and the OEIB's leadership, the HEC's work is to define new ways of allocating resources to institutions, at least partly on the basis of student outcomes and student success. And that authority which the HEC has for community colleges and public universities is a project we're very much engaged in. And then the final sort of distinction here between these two paradigms comes back to the organizational chart, and historically, whereas public universities were centrally governed and managed by the state of Oregon under the bill that Senator Hass described, as well as the bill that he helped lead last session, Senate Bill 270, we are now in a system where universities, like community colleges, are locally governed, institutionally governed by governing boards with coordination for that entire system, governed by or led by the HEC and OEIB. The next few slides will inventory some of the highlights of our work over the next year, and then I'll turn it back to Tim to really sharpen them, so a few points around our strategic thinking and, again, what's sort of different about this. 4 categories of work that we've proposed and the Commission has adopted to broaden the pathways to our 40-40-20 goal, to make those pathways accessible, affordable, and supportive for students, to steer the higher education enterprise, and to cheer the promotion of college completion and career readiness. Try and keep up with Senator Hass's marketing acumen on this. So in terms of broadening pathways, again, these are a few highlights, but I think this really begins for the HEC with refining the goals. You're very much a part of that, the 40-40 goals, and then developing key metrics to help keep us on track to reaching them. These will be reflected in any changes that we bring to the OEIB relative to achievement compacts, as well as sort of a global scorecard, if you will, that we would use to help monitor our progress towards 40-40-20. At the same token, it's really part of the same project, understanding more clearly the profile of students to be served and the needs to be met. And Tim will have more to say about some of the challenges and opportunities there in a moment. We'll be working with the Oregon Workforce Investment Board, as you heard, on middle 40 strategies, and we'll be constructing budget recommendations for the governor's and legislature's consideration relative to institutional capacity and student support. Making the pathways accessible, affordable, and supportive for students. One of the tools we have at our disposal is to monitor tuition policy and to approve or disapprove proposed tuition increases at universities greater than 5%. The second item here represents a significant category of work, including our study and possible recommendation of a pilot project for the Pay It Forward concept. A work group led by Commissioner Rob Fulmer is engaged in that. We are likewise, as of legislation that passed last session, tasked with studying the concept of providing community college for free for Oregon high school graduates. And finally, we are, through Commissioner Larry Roper's leadership, bringing forward, and the OEIB's, at the OEIB's request, we will be bringing back to you possible recommendations for redesign of the state's need-based financial aid program, the Oregon Opportunity Grant. Finally here, we will be proposing and designing mechanisms to guide and coach students through post-secondary education. This could include targeted investments, it could include a web-based portal, helping more students to navigate what is increasingly a sort of network of higher, the students are experiencing as a network of institutions, not the sort of linear first through fourth years in a single institution. The second to last sort of category of activities, again, a few highlights of budget finance and funding and success, funding and achievement subcommittee that Tim Nesbitt is leading, is working on our recommendations and ultimately policy actions around changing distribution formulas and advancing budget recommendations to the governor and legislature. Commissioner Dias is leading our work on approving university missions and establishing a process for reviewing and approving proposals to changes to academic programs or new academic programs from community colleges and universities. Likewise, Commissioner Dias is on point for working with staff to develop the evaluation criteria that we'll be using to evaluate the new university boards. There's a work group we oversee that's launching, or we intend or hope will launch a credit for prior learning pilot this year. We'll be using our convening authority to promote common standards and assessment, both within higher education and then linked to K-12. And Commissioner Ayers-Grabowski is leading our work on our convening authority to promote textbook affordability. Finally, the category that perhaps requires the most fleshing out, you don't see it here, but it is this notion that we have some responsibility for help promoting the college completion and career readiness sort of culture and actions. And so there are a few items here. Really, this should be understood under the category or the heading of outreach, engagement, and communications. I'll just note the last bullet is to launch this year, so in this current academic year, or even the remainder of this current academic year, a project that will hopefully help support more Oregon students both apply for and receive Pell Grants via completing their federal application for financial aid. And we believe that there's as many as 20% of Oregonians who are enrolled and eligible for Pell Grants from the federal government that are not receiving them today. And that's a number we hope to make a dent in. It represents up to $80 million of federal funds that we're currently foregoing, and we're hoping to make a dent in that.
Now back to the challenge. In that earlier slide, you saw the quantification of our gap for the first and second 40, where we're 189,000 degrees short of our 4-year degree goal and 480,000 degrees and certificates short of our middle 40 goal. But in order to address that gap, we really have to dig into it and understand the nature of the students to be served and the capacity of institutions to serve them. And that's what's been informing our thinking over the last 6 months as we sharpen the plan we're sharing with you. In addition to that fundamental challenge of those existing gaps which quantified, there's a systemic challenge, which you will aware of. One number we cite in our report is that starting with any given class of high school freshmen, only 39% will graduate within 5 years and proceed to a post-secondary institution within a year after high school graduation. And when you think of those are the ones who are just starting onto these pathways, much less completing them, we have a lot more to do to make sure that we're broadening access, broadening the threshold on which students enter, but also improving the pathways themselves so that students are more likely to compete. It's also the case that we face these demographic challenges, increasing numbers of students in poverty. If you look at the profile released just I think last month by the Department of Education, and you look at the percentage of students of Hispanic, Latino background, something like 19% of the high school seniors, but it's only up to 24% of the first graders. And there are other indicators as well which suggest that our challenges to succeed with these students will be increasingly difficult until we come up with successful strategies focused on their needs. The economic challenge, of course, is increasing poverty. You see that in the data on free and reduced price lunches, as well as stagnant middle class incomes, which constrains the ability of our working families to pay the bill for college education. The fiscal challenge, Governor, you know only too well, because we're now looking at, it seems to me, the revenue forecasts have continued to come in at the same mark since you and I last talked about this a couple of years ago. We're looking at growth rates of 5% a year. It used to be 6.5% a year for the decades preceding the Great Recession. And of course, the ability to free up resources to apply to our education goals will depend on controlling costs in areas like healthcare and corrections, which I continue to remind people was the reason we were so successful with the reinvestment budget you constructed in the current biennium and will have to continue to be addressed in future biennium. And then, of course, these numbers, those gaps that we originally looked at, those numbers get larger every year, because every year in which we fail to graduate students from our K-12 system, and we see many fewer than 80% pursuing a post-secondary education, and in some cases, the majority of those not completing, the number gets larger from year to year. And this is a cumulative effect, which means we have to pay attention to both students in the pipeline and to the working age adults and meet their needs, which is what you heard addressed in the earlier presentation. Agnes talked about the Oregon Workforce Investment Board and our coordination there. This other chart shows the educational attainment for various subpopulations of our students. Where this leads us is to one of 2 points of focus that I want to share with you when it comes to our funding strategies. And this one can be analogized to what's recognized in the K-12 funding formula, that W in the ADMW. That little W stands for the weighting of needs of students to be served, whether the English language learners or students from poverty backgrounds. We give extra weight and extra funding in our K-12 system to students with those challenges. We think that sticking with our idea of an outcomes-focused budgeting approach, we need to apply more of the rationale behind that weighting to how we reward our institutions who serve students from low-income backgrounds, who are the first-time college-enrolled students in their families, and who have other challenges. Now, all of our institutions at community colleges and universities are showing great success with a variety of programs. And the takeaway here is that a lot of those programs involve resources not just in the classroom, but wrap around and support services outside the classroom, counseling and mentoring and various support services. And it's that we want to try and capture and recognize in the new funding formulas we develop. We also have found from, you can see these next 2 charts, there are different levels of demand, both in the national economy and in our state economy, for different types of degrees. And it's when we can match up the demands of the kind you see displayed on these charts, which again are reflective of our state economy as well as our national economy. So you see agriculture, for instance, high in Oregon's college degree, among Oregon's college degree workforce. A lot of participation, greater than average participation in agriculture and physical fitness, sports apparel, and so We should be recognizing those degree programs and certificate programs which are high demand in the workforce, high return, high reward for those who participate and complete, but maybe higher cost to deliver. And so although we recognize this to some extent in our university funding model, the resource allocation model known as the RAM, we think we need to, across the board, including in how the funds flow to our community colleges, recognize and adequately fund those high demand, high return, and high cost programs.
You know, Jim, if I could just interject here, one of the reasons we've been discussing sort of moving to more of a GPI set of metrics is because if you do full cost accounting on the cost of education, whether that's in primary or secondary education, and particularly post-secondary education, and then add in the social cost of failing to get that education, it's quite remarkable. And I think that's a discussion that would be worth having. Because it's not that you don't pay, you pay more later, and it's really not an investment, it's an expenditure, whether that's in the social support system or whether that's in the criminal justice system or the...
That's right. And to that point, Governor, remember seeing a slide, and we used it in our strategic plan, that's not part of these slides, study done by the Chancellor's Office, which shows that in terms of return on investment for the state, we find broadly, not just in terms of revenue receipts, but also reduced social costs and increased civic participation. So all of that quantified in comparison to the state's investment. It's only after K-12, it's only after you get into the post-secondary system you see the return on investment turn positive. And that was really an eye-opener to us. As was related to this last point I want to make here, when we've gone through a decade or more of significant achievement by our institutions in spite of disinvestment, a lot of that achievement is to their credit because efficiencies continue to be achieved, but a lot has been achieved by shifting more costs to students and their families as well. And when you think of it, we're talking about the cost of a career which might return $1.5 million to $2 million in lifetime earnings, and that cost used to be $20,000, now it's $40,000 or $50,000. In a sense, as those cost shifts occur by necessity, we're reducing the return on investment for the student and family. It may actually, in some ways, be increasing the return on investment for the state. And if instead we free student and family contributions and we put more money into what the state provides for institutions, we're not increasing the state's return on investment necessarily. So we have, in order to do both, we have to get students through more quickly, more on a straighter line path, and we have to just be better about throughput. And Ed Ray has talked to you about this many times before, and he and Mary Spildy's Post-Secondary Quality Education Commission made good points of this. It's what we call the more, smarter, faster approach. And those are the things which, those kinds of improvements are the kind which will raise return on investment for both students and their families and for the state. These next two slides tell that story of disinvestment, because it's not just a matter of the nominal state dollars flowing to our institutions, but also look at the enrollment. Those top lines here, first on community, on OUS, and second on community colleges, show the increase in enrollment compared to the decrease in inflation-adjusted funding for the institutions. So those two, if you combine those two in one chart, you'd see an even steeper decline in state support, and you'd see an even greater claim on student and family resources to achieve our goals.
I'm going to wrap up by just posing a few of our ongoing questions and considerations as we went out and got feedback on this plan. I think we were left with some questions, and I'll just or some observations, and I'll just put them out there. Our strategic plan focuses on the 40-40 of 40-40-20, but as colleges have pointed out to us, they play an important role in the 20 as well, by virtue of GED programs in both high schools, middle colleges, and rural enrollment. So we don't intend to neglect that. That said, our plan today focuses primarily on that 40-40. Research matters, and by this we mean research conducted at, in particular, public universities. And by focusing on undergraduate success, as we tend to do under the 40-40-20 auspices, we may ignore, and we certainly do ignore, and there may be harm in ignoring one of the more important aspects of being a research university. So we've got that in our sights, and we're beginning to deal with that through, in particular, the development of our budget request. We've been reminded that the focus of our work is on Oregonians and their educational attainment. That said, we have to consider the benefits as well as trade-offs of relying on out-of-state students who, at our public universities, help to subsidize in-state students, and that's an issue that deserves greater attention. A legislator, when Tim and I presented to the Senate a couple of weeks ago, to a Senate committee, asked us about cost increases within higher education and what our strategies or thinking was around that particular question. Not just the impact of cost shifts to students, which obviously have been massive, but the more modest but still notable increase of costs within higher education. We are struck by the fact that sometimes a greater barrier even than the tuition and fee barrier for students may be the unavailability of certain courses. And so we need to examine the relationship. It's not necessarily as simple as make it more affordable, right? If that ends up meaning fewer courses that are necessary in order for a student to graduate, that's a problem. That's not the type of affordability that we envision. Finally, we've been reminded that while 40-40-20 doesn't directly say anything about quality, and our strategic plan doesn't say very much directly about quality, that consideration should not be at arm's length from the Commission or from the OEIB. So sort of conclude with those questions and observations. I think one of the big ahas for us in this work has been this sense that, or this understanding that responsibility for student success in higher education is not just the students. Yes, they are typically adults, but it is a shared responsibility that the state, via the OEIB and the Commission, certainly inherit, our institutions inherit, and we're all committed to.
Questions for these two?
On slide 5, I just had a question on the structure. Underneath the heck, and I'm sorry, my eyes are not.
See if you can see.
Yeah, not very well. There's a blue line, and it doesn't say what that is. Is that something, or is that just a blue line?
It's just a blue line. No, sorry, it doesn't include the label. Yeah, that represents the staff or the agency that exists under the banner of Higher Education Coordinating Commission. So we have, within our currently legislatively approved budget, we have 12 general funded positions and another 10 who are doing private post-secondary authorization and licensure, and that's in that blue bar. Those light blue bars are agency staff. So that team works with our counterparts at OSAC and CCWD to support the commission.
Okay, so it's not OUS, it's just staff that's assigned.
Yes, and the 12 that are general funded really are the positions that you can, most of which are dedicated to this transition from OUS, from the Chancellor's Office to the Higher Education Coordinating Commission.
Thank you.
Ben, I was kind of intrigued on the credit for prior learning, which is really a proficiency model. We talked about proficiency this morning. Kind of curious about that pilot, and would like to learn more about it. One thing we're doing with the Eastern Promise is created a language proficiency assessment, a language that isn't just Spanish, but it can be used for Russian, Vietnamese, and the multiple languages. And it's kind of an interesting piece to consider, because we traditionally look at our bilingual kids that one of their languages that they grew up with is a weakness rather than a strength. So when you really look at what you're talking about, credit for prior learning, the potential for our Latino students who master Spanish being able to access college credit early with the 100 level series credit for prior learning has a lot of potential, at least to start getting kids thinking about school. If they can earn 12 credits by their native language early in high school, that has a tendency, research shows that they're earning 9 credits in high school, much greater chance for completion. So I just want to, reiterate that there are a lot of examples and pilots going on out there, but this credit for prior learning, which is a proficiency-based model, has a lot of potential.
Yes, please.
Now, I would like to add to that comment, in addition to Spanish, I come from a community in Woodburn where we have 16 different indigenous languages spoken. In fact, my 2 organizers are Mixteco Indians who are fluent in Mixteco, but when you're dealing with a population of 16 different languages, just within the Mexican, migrant workers, I think the potential of looking at it as a positive, and changing the paradigm, going from a negative to a positive in terms of getting credit for them, is an excellent situation. And I think it leads to, when you look at the slide on in terms of agriculture, 70% of the folks that are working in peach rate crops now in the state of Oregon are indigenous folks. So there's a potential of earning a degree, for example, learning different, being a translator. I know there's a great need in our judicial system to hire these translators, and another in higher education also. So, I mean, the potential is a lot there. I think we have a lot of different alternatives that we need to look at to maximize and increase ways that we could really tap into that source, right? And so I also want to make a comment in terms of the HEC plan. I think one of the challenges is that we really got to focus in terms of looking at the changing demographics in the state of Oregon. The traditional recruitment methods that we use to recruit folks of color in the past is really outdated. Because we have different streams of immigrants coming into the state. And so we can't identify what the problems are. We can't get to the roots of those problems in terms of identifying how do we get those folks and their families to buy into our system, our 40/40 plan, without understanding that we can't even communicate with them if we don't have people that are even knowledgeable. First of all, the problem that we have don't understand the culture of these folks and don't even speak their language. And and I go back to the comment I made about 70% of the migrant workers that work in the state of Oregon in peach rate crops are indigenous. So that in itself is an alarming statistic that we have to deal with. And these are people that are putting the food on their table, and these are folks that are rooted in the state of Oregon. Oregon has now become a home-based state for migrant workers, meaning that they migrate to as far away as Florida, North Carolina, and New York, but they come back to Oregon. And their kids are here. They have kids that are born here. They have kids where they're speaking monolingual language, and it's not Spanish. It's one of the 16 indigenous languages, right? So that's going to present a big challenge. So I think in the HEC, we're starting to get into the weeds about that and see ways that we can do an effective outreach program where we understand the problem and then move forward on it. So it's really exciting, at least for me, to be part of the HEC, to really make some major accomplishments so that we can really achieve the 40-40-20 plan. Thank you.
Ben, I wonder if you would be willing to entertain any input or questions about the middle 40 presentation. We're going to have a little bit of comment. I hope we can certainly do it at the next meeting, but if anyone has any questions about it.
This is a good time because we do want to vote on it. So if we hear any questions or concerns, we can, not now, next time, so we can work on it between now and next time. So Hannah, I know you had a question. Do you want to?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I did not look at this prior to, I think this is great, and I'm referring to the what's next question that you have on the back side. And so in number one, the initial goal for the working age population. So we had talked about this when 40-40-20 was brought forward, that the report that we had was that we didn't actually have 40% in that middle. So is that what you're looking at to find that number? What the sweet spot is to make sure that we have the jobs available for those that we train? Is that what we're looking for?
Yeah, you'll recall that the legislation, which you've seen now on several slides, speaks to a 40-40-20 goal for the entire adult population. This board pretty quickly recognized that we're not really talking about 40-40-20 for all adults, but that we do have aspirations, we should have aspirations, at least for working age adults, and that those aspirations or those goals ought to be aligned, that this is the proposal at least, that those goals ought to be aligned and attuned to both short and, let's say, medium term or projections about actual labor market demands. We want to be helping to prepare working age adults for the jobs that are available or likely to be available. And so the proposal is to get a better handle on that and establish what those numbers are.
So, and we can get those numbers for now from the department, and I'm sorry I forget the gentleman who presented that. But then moving forward, we had a little bit of a conversation, I think, about how do we work with the business community to build those jobs, those living wage jobs that will allow someone coming out of our institutions with a degree to be able to repay their loans and have a living wage. So is that part of this too? Are we bringing in the business community to have those conversations as we look at this? Or is this just an initial? Trying to get a sense of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think that the larger question of the business community's, employer community's engagement in workforce development and in hiring will certainly be reflected through the participation of employers in the Oregon Workforce Investment Board, and likely this task force that's created between the HEC and the Workforce Investment Board. That particular action item is a fairly technical step, I would suggest, done largely in through consultation with the Oregon Department of Employment to more clearly understand. They survey employers. They actually call them up and say, what jobs do you have available? What jobs are you likely to have available? What are the certificate degree requirements for those jobs? And we'll get that data to help inform you on potential near-term goals for the adult side of 40-40-20.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Great, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Now we have Zeke Smith from United Way, who's going to give us a presentation from the Portland City Club's GED study. Mr. Cole, you were involved in that too? You're keyed up for it.
So I wanted to share a little bit about why we have invited Zeke from the GED study group, and we had another guest that looks like as well. So I have the pleasure of serving as the chair of the Equity and Partnership Subcommittee, and we are working on a policy recommendation for the full OEIB focusing on out-of-school youth. So we have seen many presentations on our graduation rate that on average hovers a little over 60%. I'm sure we're all very good at math, which means that we recognize that a large portion of our young people are not in school. Certainly when we look at subpopulations like our Latino and African American, Native and Pacific Islander communities, we know that we have as many as half of our young people not in school. And so we feel very passionate about this topic and really creating what we have been referencing not as a pipeline but really as a shoreline, so that we have a variety of very positive options for our young people so that they can fully be part of all aspects of 40-40-20. I think the other piece that is very important for us to share is that while we do feel that the GED is a very important aspect of the out-of-school youth, we also recognize that the topic of GED should not just be a topic for the Equity Committee. In fact, we feel a little uncomfortable that GED has somehow fallen within the hands of the Equity Committee, in that this is an opportunity for leadership for not only the HEC, but the full OEIB and every educational leader in the state. The reason we decided to take it on is frankly, when we looked at the data and saw the incredible overrepresentation of young people of color in our dropout statistics, we were very concerned that when we looked at the young people who were participating in GED programs, GED wraparound services and supports, people of color were underrepresented when you would think that they would be very much present. And so as we took on out of school youth, we felt like we would naturally want to provide some leadership in this. We also wanted to say that this report, we have been looking at it for our last 2 meetings, and part of the reason we felt like it was so important to bring this presentation is that we felt like it was really excellent work. We felt like we're at a pivotal point in our country and in the state around GED, and actually our committee has decided to take many of these recommendations and include them in our out-of-school overall recommendations as well. So with that, I would invite our 2 guests to present and share the larger report. And I feel like I should disclose I am a member of the Board of Governors for the City Club, so full transparency.
Thank you for the introduction, Board Member Maher. Governor Kitzhaber, thank you both in your role as our state executive and in your role here as the chair of the OEIB, and thank you to the rest of the board members for this opportunity to speak before you today. I'm Zeke Smith, the Chief Impact Officer of the United Way of the Columbia Willamette. I also had the pleasure of serving as the chair of a Portland City Club Research Committee, which produced the report that you have in front of you, A Second Chance for Oregon, High School Dropouts in GED. The City Club of Portland formally adopted this research report by an overwhelming majority of the membership in late January. I also wanted to acknowledge that speaking with me today is Melvin Oden-Orr, who was also a research committee member and is the advocacy committee chair, so he'll speak in a moment about that process. So we want to share with you a little bit about the recommendations from our report, as well as the actions that we're taking on behalf of the City Club and the advocacy committee. Most importantly, we want to convey a sense of urgency and opportunity for making tangible systemic changes to better support the nearly 340,000 adults across Oregon who currently do not have a high school diploma or its equivalent, and the staggering 8,000 young people who join them each year as we fail to ensure they get a diploma coming out of high school. It was helpful to listen to the report previously and know that the focus is really on working age adults. I'm not sure what number of the 360,000 are working age, but I know that it's significant. So a little bit of context that I know you understand, but I think it bears repeating. And some of this Nicole acknowledged. So again, roughly 340,000 adults without a diploma or equivalent across Oregon. Significant overrepresentation amongst Black, Latino, Native American, and Pacific Islander communities. No matter how well our K-12 system makes improvements in the coming years, and I know as well as anyone that there are significant improvements that are occurring and will continue to occur, this pattern of continued systemic failures in ensuring that young people leave our public education system with the right skills and credentials to succeed is not going to end anytime soon. So again, with communities of color most assuredly carrying the burden of this in their communities, it feels that we need to be thinking about other ways to address the issue. So the other issue, I think, in relation to that is that we have a diversifying population, as I know you all have discussed. I've heard or seen estimates between 38 and 43%, so let's just say 4 out of 10 young people in our state are of color. And we know that over 50% of the babies that were born in this state last year were Latino. So these are populations we know we can't ignore if we intend to have a thriving state economy and community. You've been really clear about that in terms of your equity policy and the work you've done. So another key piece of context is the foresight of this body, of you, the governor, and the legislature in passing the 40-40-20 framework, which you are talking about today. We believe this means there's a real positive opportunity to change the dynamic that currently exists in a more profound way than we ever have before. And yet, at the same time, when you take all these statements in combination, it's pretty clear we do not currently have a complete plan for ensuring we meet our 40-40-20 goals by 2025. So you heard a bit about some of the recommendations for impacting our capacity to meet our aspirations in the middle 40 and to some degree the final 20. We hope you'll consider ours as a critical on-ramp to all of the levels of the 40-40-20. Without a clear strategy to re-engage those adults who've left the system without a diploma or its equivalent, to provide them with the necessary supports as well as a way to capture those young people who've not yet fallen off the boat but will in the years to come, we will never meet our goals, nor should we take comfort or satisfaction with where we'll stand. So last contextual point. We have an entirely new GED system in place across the country as of this January. And we in Oregon have work to do to be fully prepared to use this as a primary means to meet the needs of the disconnected. This isn't the only tool in this effort, but it's definitely our most significant if we choose to use it as such. So we have a new GED system. It's not just a test, but it's a battery of supports for students, administrators, and systems. It provides preparatory tools, tools for individual and aggregate analysis at each of those levels. It offers both a basic passing level equivalent to the skills gained by a graduate of high school, and it also offers an honors passing level equivalent to college and career readiness. I'm not here to rep the new GED. We'll let the GED testing service do that. But a couple questions. Will this new system more effectively support individuals who are looking for a way to re-engage in education and get back on the pathway that is important for them? Will it provide Oregon with a powerful tool in our effort to improve the effectiveness of our system to ensure every individual Oregonian can succeed? I don't have the answer to those questions, but it does seem to be an improvement on the system that we had in place previously. And we think Oregon should do everything in our power to both make this broader assessment of the quality of the GED system and to support the full capacity to make it the right tool if it's deemed to be as such. In the absence of an alternative in Oregon, it's the one we have. So our recommendations are largely designed to create the framework and the capacity to do just this, to support our ability to most effectively use the GED in re-engaging disconnected young adults and to monitor the actual effectiveness of that system. To that end, I'll give you a broad sense of our recommendations. I'm going to read from the executive summary of the report, which any of you have in front of you. So number one, the Oregon Department of Education and the Oregon Education Investment Board should launch a public outreach program that targets diverse communities and stakeholders across the state and helps them develop a clear understanding of the new 2014 GED program. Number two, the Oregon's Chief Education Officer should develop and implement a coordinated funding and strategic framework across departments for GED preparation, testing, soft skill development programs, and related wraparound services, which is a core piece of the recommendations that we're happy to talk about more. Number three, the legislature should allocate dedicated funding to subsidize GED testing for qualified students with demonstrable need. Number four, Oregon's public universities should update their admission criteria to allow admissions for qualified recipients of the 2014 revision of the GED. A happy moment here. I want to acknowledge the Oregon University system recently made these modifications to the admissions criteria reflecting the new GED standards. So in our book, we have check mark number one. We're excited about that. Number five, officials should collect information about the GED as well as the college and career performance of people after they earn it and report back to Oregonians regularly. So again, is this the right GED system? Is this the right mechanism for us to re-engage young adults? Not sure, but we probably ought to figure out the answer to that question together, and we need to do some work to figure it out. Number six, we ask that you as the governor would direct the Department of Administrative Services to prepare an annual report that contains a clear accounting of state funds that are allocated for GED test preparation, testing, and related support services. We know that there are significant resources across multiple departments that are funding different aspects of GED attainment in this state. Is that being done in an effective and efficient manner? Is that most effectively meeting the needs of the students or the young people that need it the most? We don't know the answer to that question. So we feel like it would be worthwhile to do some work to figure that out. Number 7, officials should take a fresh look at alternatives to the GED in a few years. In other states, they are actually using alternative tests or assessments to the GED. We've made a decision in the state to stay with the GED as the primary system, but we probably ought to look at the value and the effectiveness of some of those other systems, particularly with some populations for whom the GED may not be an effective tool. And in particular, one of those populations that people are concerned about are English language learners. Number 8, then this is the final recommendation. We ask that the Oregon Speaker, the House, and Senate President should direct the Office of Legislative Counsel to conduct a review of applicable laws and administrative rules that refer to the GED. Council should suggest revisions to treat the high set and task, which are two of the other alternatives that states are putting in place, and any other approved GED alternative in other states as equivalent to the GED for purposes of law, post-secondary education, public service, and benefits. We will have people who will be moving to this state that will have alternatives to the GED. We should have a system in place for recognizing them. In a moment, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Our report went into much more detail about the specific rationale for each of these recommendations. But now I'd like to turn the mic over to my fellow committee member, Melvin Oden-Orr, who will share a bit more about where we hope to go with these recommendations and the partners who are aligning behind this work.
Very good. Can everybody hear me? Governor, committee members, as I said, my name is Melvin Oden-Orr. I'm serving as the chair of the Advocacy Committee. As many of you know, the City Club of Portland is known for conducting a number of research projects looking at very important public policies. And so last year it undertook this the research related to the GED, and that's the work that Zeke and I took part in. And as a part of that work, we were able to sit down with over 40 organizations and community members who have some experience working on issues. We talked with organizations that serve high school dropouts, some that are under the age of 18, still in a position where they can attain a diploma. We also talked with organizations that work on workforce readiness, and we've talked with several of the community colleges in the Willamette Valley as well as Eastern Oregon. And so we went through great pains to really get a good sense of what the issues were with the GED. And based on that work, we've come up with these recommendations. The next stage of our work, as far as the City Club is concerned, is to serve as a convener for those organizations and individuals that have this interest in seeing our young people go on to higher heights. And so that's the work that we're looking forward to moving forward now. The way that we plan on doing that is as, if you will, a convener of those organizations. And in fact, we've reached out to them and shared with all of them the results of our research and our recommendations. And we've invited them to come back and convene with us to talk about more fully how the recommendations that we've come up with would help them achieve the goals that they have and help them in the work that they do serving our young people. And as of today, we've been able to identify a nice cross-section of the community. We have business organizations, we have several community colleges, Portland Community College, Blue Mountain Community College, some of the youth organizations, we have youth builders. I actually have a list here, I can read them off for you. We've worked with, among our coalition, we're going to have Oregon Tradeswomen, Constructing Hope, which is a pre-apprenticeship program, just like Oregon Tradeswomen. We're going to be working with Work Systems, Inc., Blue Mountain Community College, Oregon Business Council, Portland Public Schools, PCC, Open Meadows, Portland Youth Builders, the Yes to College program at PCC, Gateway to College, and we hope to have many others sign on to help us with this work. And what we hope is, working with those groups, that we would be able to identify how these recommendations are going to help them. And then we also hope to convene with decision makers at different levels, those that are related to the recommendations that we have, to engage them, to give them a better sense of how these recommendations will work in real life. And so that's the work that we're going to be doing, and hopefully by the end of the year we'll see more than just the one check mark
as we move through all the recommendations to get them implemented. And so, if there are any questions.
Thank you. Questions? Kate, go ahead.
I'm real pleased to see this work going on. I've got a couple of concerns, and one of them has been alluded to, and that is we don't want to create this process and this degree, if you will, and make it a segregated class that's disproportionately represented by students of color. And I've always had that concern about the GED. It doesn't carry with it high esteem by young people who take the degree because they believe that it is a segregated class of students that have that certificate and are able to do whatever the next step is. Secondly, at some point in Oregon, we're going to need to address whether or not 4 years are required for a high school diploma. We've not had that conversation, but I think that at some point in time in the very near future, we're going to need to have that conversation because I think one of the reasons that students drop out of high school is that they don't see the relevancy of a 4-year program. They don't see that they're learning, there's new learning for in that 4th year. And either we begin to beef up that 4th year so students do see some relevancy, or we begin to address whether or not a 3-year program could be just as effective for a high school diploma as a 4-year. And I think if we have that conversation, we might see less need for the GED. I do believe that at some point in time we do need to call it something other than that, because I do think it does carry negative connotation.
Yeah. So to your points, Ms. Tran, so there were, one of the things that the committee felt very strongly about was we're not advocating for the GED as an answer for everyone. It's for those who really need a second chance. So for example, those who are 21 years of age are beyond the reach of getting a high school diploma because there is no longer support for them at that age. The GED provides an opportunity for them to have a second chance at college, trade programs, apprenticeships, things like that, that they are otherwise ineligible for because they don't have the high school diploma. And so we really have tried to emphasize this is not a replacement for the high school diploma, but instead a second opportunity for people to be able to move on to not just be that 20, but to, as Zeke pointed out, to become a part of that 40 and that other 40. And during our interviews, we were able to hear from someone who told us a story about someone who had a GED and had gone on to graduate from Harvard Law School. I was jealous. Yes, I was.
Board Member Tran, I think 2 other quick things. One, I would say, completely agree. I look forward to a day when all of our kids are graduating from high school in the system that we have available to us. The reality is that's not in the near future, for better or for worse. And in the meantime, one of the things we do know is that the point at which communities of color are most significantly overrepresented is in that population of people who neither graduate from high school nor get a GED or its equivalent. So that's the largest overrepresentation, and that then represents a significant barrier to their continued success, whether it's an inability to get access to financial aid because they don't have a GED or a high school diploma, or whether it's an inability to get access to higher education or to a trade school because they don't either have the skills or they don't have the certification. So part of what we talked about was really being intentional about this as a tool within the current reality that we operate. Second thing I'd say is we also recommend that somebody, it wasn't this group, but somebody pay some more attention to what's most effective for young people who still have an opportunity to graduate from high school by the time they're 18 or 19 years old. I would suggest that there are too many young people who are accessing the GED as a route out of high school and then are limiting their potential in the way the system was designed in the past, and that seems to be problematic. And then the third piece I'd say is we did talk a lot about this idea of marketing the GED. Felt like it was outside of the purview of our committee, but we would wholeheartedly agree that there are significant perception issues in addition to the reality of what a GED represents in the current system.
My comments were not meant to argue against the GED at all. Just need to clean it up.
Dr. Henry.
very appreciative of both the City Club report and your coming before us. I know under Superintendent Saxton's arm wrestling, and also with Interim Commissioner Gerald Hamilton, we at the State Board of Education had an extensive discussion at our meeting last Thursday, Friday, about the GED, looking at the report and trying to seek some new directions. One of the pieces that seemed to come across was that for increasingly, and in other states, and for several other states, if not many other states, the GED has become the alternative high school completion mark. And that is something that bears some further inspection, where for a variety of reasons, including sometimes where the high school curriculum is not challenging, or through budget cuts has been neglected in the senior year, students are encouraged to drop out and get the GED, and that's a phenomena that I think represents just some of the complexity. I'm hoping that we can seize this opportunity to really have a concert, if you will, with many voices and many levels of participation in talking about both the new GED, which is, as my understanding, is going to have the kind of steady research behind it that suggests it is a different GED, if you will, which means that then we have the obligation to look at what happens with respect to students who are then taking the GED. I share my colleague Kay's concerns about what I usually call ghettoization of the GED for students of color and students from limited income backgrounds. And I think we've got to be really careful as we begin to formulate ways for the GED to be effective, the new GED, to be effective in terms of looking at our whole picture of the 40-40-20. So I do want to say that several of the points you made really resonate with some of the thinking that we're doing. I think we need to have some more discussion and agreement on what is it we expect of it, and where is it going to fit within our panoply of different approaches to what's going on. And self-disclosure, my nephew was encouraged to drop out of school, get his GED, and then enter a management program. Fortunately, he didn't stay there and he joined the Marine Corps. There's another whole piece of that story. But I think there are a lot of pieces of this reality that that we need to have some more information on.
Anna, and then I'll call myself.
I appreciate the report, and I think it's something that we definitely should make sure that we address some of the issues around the GED. But I think the bigger question is, why are our students dropping out of high school? Why are we not able to keep them? Kay brought up one possible reason. I think we dig in and really ask the question, start with the why, and engage with parents and students about why it's not working for them right now. What do we need to do differently? Because I think the end game is to keep each and every student in our schools until they're ready to move on to the next level. And we're not there right now. And we need to figure it out. So I hope we can engage in that conversation.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a comment and a little addition to share, which I think is really important, particularly as we co-convene with the HEC. One thing that's not commonly known is that when we have students who are graduating from high school with a modified diploma, many of those students are actually not eligible for financial aid if they graduate with a modified diploma. And so, and particularly if they attempt to go on to higher education without the correct diagnosis, they will not get any support, and their families will have to accept the entire burden of paying for their education. The other reality is that, of course, we once again see unprecedented overrepresentation of children of color graduating with modified diplomas in the state of Oregon. And so I think that part is really important. Hopefully we will be able to develop some strategies to resolve that. I feel very hopeful that we can accomplish that. I think it's important in this context as well. I wish we were in a problem where we had too many students of color getting their GEDs. Right now, as I mentioned when we began, we're incredibly underrepresented. And so, again, we need to address our dropout issue. We have a long way to go. And until such time, we need a variety of positive options for young people. I think this is really a question of leadership and alignment. We have two populations, adults who do not have diplomas who need GED supports, who are then referred on to our community colleges, leaving our community colleges in a very challenging situation where they don't necessarily have the wraparound supports of the adequate funding to really support those adults. And then we also have a significant number of high school students who are correctly or incorrectly encouraged to drop out and go and get their GED, sometimes with supports, oftentimes without. And I just think it would be negligent of us to not think about some of the short things that we need to do to really honor and demonstrate that these students deserve the honor and respect of getting an adequate education.
Rob.
You guys talked a little bit at the beginning about what makes the new GED new, and I understand that there's detail in the report, but so the old GED was a 10th grade level, and the new GED is sort of a nationwide aggregate 12th grade level, is that correct?
Not necessarily. So the old GED had last been benchmarked in 2003. At that point of benchmarking, they did they engaged in a process of working with current 12th graders or recent graduates to identify what was the skill level. So it wasn't the notion of what do we think the skill level should be for graduating seniors. It was what was that current skill level at that point in time. So I think part of what happened is colloquially we started to talk about that as a much lower level than the level of education as we move through the years. That process will still be used for the passing level of the GED, the standard level, which is that they have engaged thousands of students from across the country, 12th grade and or recent graduates, identify kind of what's that baseline in terms of their skill level. That becomes the passing GED level. The big distinction at this point, or one of the biggest changes, is there's also what's called an honors level, which is normed at a level that's considered college and career ready. That's a whole other conversation that you all get to have significantly, but the intent there is that those individuals ought to be at a skill level that they can move on to post-secondary education and immediately engage in, not have to engage in remediation as they move forward.
Just a quick follow-up. So the new GED is also supposed to be assessing critical thinking and problem-solving skills that align with the Common Core standards that are, and the old GED didn't do that at all. So that, I mean, that's another significant difference, right?
Correct.
So it's safe to say that the new GED is going to be significantly more difficult to pass in all likelihood than the old one. Is the suggestion, based on what we've seen so far, that that's the case?
Well, as GED committee members for the City Club, we are lay researchers, so I will just say that up front. I think part of the question is what is the skill level of current graduating 12th graders across the country, because that will predicate what that basic GED level is. I would anticipate that that is probably more rigorous than what the previous passing level was, and we know that the honors level will be more rigorous than the previous passing level. So part of the conversation we had at our committee level, I know some of the concerns that people have out there is that this will leave some young people or some adults behind who previously may have gotten a GED. Legitimate conversation and question about what is the GED for, and is it really about college and career ready, and if so, to what degree does this state align itself around that honors level, to what degree do we align ourselves around the standard level? Those are some of the questions that I think you all are talking about.
And I'll add to that. I think in the report we pointed out some of the things that we saw as potential barriers.
the fact that the test is going to be taken on computer. But another potential concern or potential issue is the idea that just like students are now being taught to the Common Core and expected to perform at that level, the expectation is that that's going to be more challenging. The test is, as we understand it, designed to be that same sort of challenge for students.
Thank you. That goes a long way to explaining what really makes the GED new and why the idea of rebranding it is so important.
Do you know the pass rate currently of the GED?
I don't remember. It's hard to find the pass rate. I can tell you that this is not what you asked, but to open up the door. The rate of GED attainers going on to post-secondary education is 12%, so it's a very low rate. And I bring that up because I think it's one of the questions that clearly this group would be interested in studying. I will say, Rob, that one of the other big differences is the analytical tools that are now built into the system that are available at a statewide level, that are available at a testing level, that can be disaggregated by race, that can be disaggregated by geography, that give us a number of opportunities to consider how and where providers are supporting adults successfully to get the GED, and the degree to which that GED is successfully meeting our needs and interests in the workforce, interests that we have moving forward. So that is another big difference from a systemic perspective that I hope this body considers.
Ms. Tran, further to your question, there are currently about 336,000 Oregonians that do not have a diploma, and of that number, 53,000 are between the ages of 18 and 24. And so, while I don't have a passage rate, we do know that there's this definite segment of the population that would benefit from having a more robust effort to, if you will, provide them a second chance to move on to career in college.
I have a couple of points I want to make. First of all, thank you for shining a light on this very important topic. I really appreciate your work. And in terms of the recommendations, I don't really have anything substantively to say about them, except that what was glaringly missing to me was the role of the Community Colleges and Workforce Development Department, which is the state agency that has oversight over the testing centers and the preparation programs in the 17 community colleges. And I'm hoping that's just an oversight and not some message about their role, because they do have a convening role, I believe, and a responsibility at state level to be a good partner and convener in this work. Secondly, I know that the focus is disconnected youth, but that 340,000, we get many of them who come back who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, coming back to do 70s actually, to do their GED. So there's a huge population of Oregonians who access the GED who are not in the disconnected youth population. We need to remember them. And then thirdly, I appreciated the funding recommendations, because this GED is, adult basic ed generally, is so inadequately funded. In community colleges, we can't charge tuition, and now that tuition is 45 or 50% of our budget, this is a losing proposition for us if we were only to decide to do it because of finances. We do it because it's part of our mission, and we want to make sure that students have access. The fourth thing is that of the many people who don't have high school diplomas in the state of Oregon, many of them bypass the GED, because to go to a community college, they don't need the high school diploma or the GED. They can come, because we're non-selective open access, they can come directly to the college. Many of them can come directly into college level courses. Unfortunately, many of them have to start in developmental ed, but they decide not to do the GED, so that's another population. So it would be interesting to know how many students have no high school diploma, no GED, but have college level courses that they've already completed. That would be an interesting figure. I was just wondering, Gerald, if you have the figures on...
I actually don't with me, but you know, while I can answer the question you just asked, how many people don't have them, and it's hard to put together names. What I would suggest is that We do have a series of statistics around the GED that we could make available through Nancy's office the next day or two that would give you, I think, a breadth of what's going on and answer your question very candidly and correctly. So we'd be more than happy to do that in the next couple of 3 days, if you'd like.
I will. Thank you, Joe. Tim?
Mary, just to make sure I'm tracking, and it looks like we've got some more work to do to get more clarity on this, but the student doesn't need a GED to proceed to community college and get financial aid. Is that right?
Yeah.
But a student who gets a modified high school diploma cannot get financial aid?
You feel is that all right? I can turn off the Bob, but the minimum standard for entrance into community college is the ability to benefit. Which means the ability to benefit. It means you can actually benefit from the program. The new required financial aid really is a GED, I believe, and or a diploma. And I'll let Bob speak to it if you'd like. But we do have students that come, that do not have either one of those, and we do accept them. But my understanding is that they.
And last legislative session, there was a bill passed that required Oregon colleges and universities to not deny financial aid to students that had a modified or extended diploma. So they are eligible for the Oregon Opportunity Grant. However, that does not extend to federal financial aid. So they're not eligible for the Pell Grant or federal student loans.
Okay, let me get this straight. You get financial aid, both state and federal, with a GED. You can get financial aid with a modified diploma in Oregon now. But you can't get federal money.
Correct.
Wow. So a student can get a 24-credit high school diploma without passing those standards, and now cannot get federal. Wow.
And I believe some students
That's a barrier.
actually go back and get their GED after they've earned a modified diploma just so they can access it financially.
Hannah and then Nancy.
And just to put a point on that, with the new Smart Balance assessment, if students don't pass that modified diploma, will impact a whole lot more of our students across the state. I just really want to tell you how much I admire your city club. I think this is extraordinary for the work you've done in this committee, and as you can see, it created a rich conversation. And, they are moving on the Achievement Compact is a shared responsibility, and it's going to take all of us to bring to light all of these issues. And I want you to know it's part of what we do now that these issues have been brought up, to work with the HAC, to work with ODE, to really start thinking about all of these and how do we make it a seamless system. I want people to know Rob and I are on the modified diploma. As is Representative Gallagher, it's an issue that has really emerged, and like you said, it makes no sense. And but in general, what I know is sometimes some students do use the GED is really the thing that really helps them go along the pathway. Sometimes maybe it happens not with the intentions we want it to be, meaning a choice for a student to help them get to where they ultimately want to get, but you've just really helped us raise some really important issues, and in our committees, through the Equity Committee and through the OEIB, and I'm sure in the HAC, because there's a piece there, we'll really work on these issues so that we can create a smooth pathway. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's take a 10-minute break. Okay.
We realize that probably because we're all appointed by the governor, he knows everyone, but we may not know each other. So a little, better late than never. Maybe we should go around and introduce ourselves, Peg and OEIB. So Duncan, would you like to
Hi,
start?
I'm Duncan Wise, Oregon Council member of the HAC.
Tim Nesbitt, member of the HAC.
Kevin Cannon, Executive Director for that.
Rob Saxton, Deputy Superintendent of the Oregon Department of Education, Advisor to the OEIB.
Tara Weekly, Early Learning System Director.
I'm Bob Brew, Interim Executive Director for the Oregon Student Access Commission.
Gerald Hamilton, interim executive director, CCW.
Hannah Vander, elementary PE teacher and member of the OEIB.
Samuel Henry, member of the OEIB and the OSB, and my day job is faculty at Portland State.
I'm Nancy Golan, I'm the Chief Education Officer.
Mary Spilty, President, Lane Community College, and alternate chair for OEIB.
I'm Mark Mulvihill, I'm Superintendent of Intermountain ESD, OEIB.
Yvonne Curtis, Forest Grove School District Superintendent and Chair of the Best Practices and Transitions.
Gage Ram, OEIB, my day job is CEO of Volunteers of America.
Vicki Chamberlain, the Director of Teacher Standards and Practices Committee, the Licensing Board, and OEIB Advisory.
Rob Fulmer, I'm staff at Portland State University and I'm a member of that.
Lee Ayers, Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Southern Oregon University and member of that.
Frank Goulard, Portland Community College math faculty, proudly teaching in my 5th decade. That's not 50 years, but in each of 5 successive decades, and on the hat.
Having saved the best to last, I'm getting involved with that.
David.
David Reeves, American Federation of Teachers, Oregon. I'm also a longtime teacher at this campus, teaching English as a second language at the Rock Creek campus here. And I am on both. I'm on the OEIB and the HEC.
And Neil?
And Neil, would
Introduce
you
yourself.
introduce yourself?
I'm Neil Bryant. I'm an attorney from Bend, Oregon. I'm on the HEC, and I was in the Oregon State Senate for 8 years.
Okay. So let's move on with the agenda then. We're moving to budget strategies and initial priorities, and Whitney, staff at OEIB, is going to do that.
Good afternoon, members of the OEIB and HEC. It's nice to meet you all. I'm glad that we have the opportunity to hear from each of you. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, and I do mean a little because I know everyone's getting tired, but talking about the OEIB's process for creating recommendations that we will provide to the governor for the 15-17 budget development cycle. And you'll see as part of your materials a very draft budget strategies document. It's so draft that you'll even find places in it with blanks and me making pleas to my colleagues to help me finish it. But what this is aimed to do is really orient the P20 system, all of the agencies, all of our stakeholders, all of our institutions around a few key ideas that sort of form the backbone of the OEIB's strategic plan and in particular priorities that it has been thinking about for the last 2 years. It also is intended to really be an invitation to the field and to agencies and to others who might be thinking about the budget development process to think creatively, to engage, and to offer their input to the OEIB in pursuit of the most transformative education budget that we can develop. So I'm not going to walk through the paper in detail, but I will give you a little bit of just kind of the framework for how it's organized. And then I would love it if you had questions, comments, anything that you see missing, things that you want clarity around. I'll also talk a little bit about the budget development process. And again, I think that's a place where I would invite you to chime in, provide your feedback. It's a really something of an organic process that we're developing as we go along, so I would appreciate that. So in the budget strategies and initial priorities, if you look really the way it's designed on page 3, there are 3 strategies, and these are the same 3 strategies that the OEIB has been working toward since it was created. And they are to strategy 1, create a coordinated student-centered education system from birth through college and career. Strategy 2, focus state investments on achieving key student outcomes. And strategy 3, building a statewide support system. The first strategy, this seamless system of education, In the last biennium, a lot of work was done, and really the folks sitting around this horseshoe right now are proof of this. There was a lot of work done to really begin at the state level to create this coordinated system of education. So to begin to rethink, as Ben showed you his picture of what the education system looks like, to really rethink at the state level what a seamless system would look like. OEIB and the Chief Education Officer really want this biennium to be about how we transform the education system from the perspective of the student. So how do we go to the next step in the process from designing ourselves in a seamless P20 system to really designing the pathway for students in a way that feels seamless to them. And to that end, the paper describes 2 critical transition points that the OEIB believes are important for us to focus on. The first is the age 3 to grade 3 transition, so really the transition of supporting our youngest Oregonians, getting them ready to learn, ready for kindergarten, and then smoothly transitioning into our K-12 system in a way that meets their and their families' needs. And the second transition point is one that we've talked about today, and that I know many of you are thinking about in the wee hours of the night as well as all day long, and that is the grades 11 to 14 transition. How do we really rethink our system and really remove those barriers, and also just create a different and more innovative way of delivering services for students as they move through high school and on into post-secondary. So those 2 pieces of work, I think, are critical things to be thinking about, and the Outcomes and Investment Subcommittee will be digging in a little deeper to develop some thinking about how do we use all this work that's gone on in the different subcommittees to design some budget strategies that can move forward around one or both of those critical transition points. With respect to strategy 2, this is really, it's kind of overarching, but we put it as one strategy, which is how we focus investments on achieving student outcomes. And that really entails a couple critical pieces. One being increasing investment at all levels. I think for purposes of post-secondary, we saw some slides that really show over time the state's disinvestment. We know that's true at every level of education. And a number one sort of design principle or priority is that we're moving toward trying to make the system more efficient and effective, and build buy-in in the state to be able to increase the level of investment. The other piece, I think, that is critically important, and the governor mentioned it in his talking points at the beginning, is to continue our thinking around how we transform the use of our base funding in the education system. We know that the large, vast majority, 95% of education funding in the state flows through to educational institutions. And the Outcomes and Investment Subcommittee, as well as Dr. Golden, are really interested in going further in our thinking about how we can really shift the way that base funding is being used in order to incentivize better outcomes for students. I know that HEC is thinking a lot about this in terms of how it's approaching allocation of funding to the post-secondary institutions. And early learning, they're also thinking about how to deliver services in a different way to make sure that we're incenting outcomes, and at the K-12 level as well, some thinking needs to be done about how to really orient the system around these outcomes. There's some discussion about strategic investments, and I think that's a place where the HEC can really dig in and help the OEIB in its thinking. In the last biennium, the strategic investments were largely focused on K-12, and I think in retrospect, we've learned that they were maybe a little bit too ambitious of a set of strategies rather than a focused kind of transformational plan. So if you look on page 10, there are some very high level, and probably too many, but a start to a set of criteria for strategic investments that could guide us moving forward. And I think the key, probably the key idea here is we don't want to create a system where we're basically shifting and folks are competing for strategic investment grants for all of the things that it is that the system needs to accomplish. We want strategic investments to be transformational, to be short-term, to be used to really demonstrate how the system can perform better rather than just replacing our base funding with a set of strategic investments that are over and above. So those are some, I think, critical things to consider. There are a few leverage points that are listed in the paper, third grade reading being a critical leverage point, post-secondary access and affordability being a critical leverage point, and STEM being a critical leverage point. Again, I would welcome any feedback that you would like to provide now or in the future as we move to finalize this strategy paper. The last section talks about something that I think is OEIB has been thinking about and has really created a lot of excitement across the state, which is this idea of regional collaboration. Many of you know that we have a pilot going on right now, a regional achievement collaborative pilot in 12 regions of the state, and in each of those regions there are school districts, many early learning providers, K-12 partners, school districts, and post-secondary partners that are engaging with the broader community about thinking about how to create sort of a collective vision for reaching the Achievement Compact goals and moving toward 40-40-20. It's exciting in many ways. One, it's P20. We've got cross-sector partnerships where folks are taking a kind of shared ownership for the various outcomes. And in addition, it really opens up this conversation of how could we leverage in the state the work that's happening in the healthcare transformation through CCOs, the early learning hubs that Ripley and her staff are leading, the work that's going on in workforce development and health and human services, and how could we maybe create a kind of cross-sector regional approach and some investment opportunities that could be innovative in that way. So the last part of the paper is really about the state system and the need for us to continue investing in our state system of accountability, of our state data system, the longitudinal data system, in developing a more robust policy research function at the state level, which I think is incredibly critical to answering these hard questions that we've all been thinking about. And then the need for us to really continue to invest in a network for quality teaching and learning. So how are we supporting our educators? How can we broaden those efforts to really include our post-secondary educators as well as our K-12 educators and our early learning providers, but really having a strong system of support in our state for excellence in the delivery of our education. So those are really the critical ideas that are in here, and I would be happy to take any questions and love to hear any comments anyone has or any questions at this point, if you're not asleep.
Whitney, could you remind us of the timeline for the next steps?
Great, thank you, Chair Stolbe. I'll kind of talk a little bit about the timeline to orient everyone. So we've, the Outcomes and Investments Subcommittee, which is made up of members of the OEIB, the Urban Learning Council, and the HEC, are really taking the lead on kind of serving as the sort of coordinating body and the traffic cop, if you will, around all of these different groups that are working on various investment proposals. They have looked at the paper, they gave feedback, not so much on the paper, but really on the process and the need for ensuring that we're aligning with best practice, that we're really offering opportunities for the public to get input, but that we're allowing for input on something that is understandable to the greater public. And so early next month, we'll be taking back to Outcomes and Investments another revision of the paper, as well as kind of a one-pager that can graphically depict these ideas in a way that's really accessible and easy for us to make actionable. And then a more thorough fleshing out of the budget process timeline that you all saw at the last meeting. So at this point, we're still figuring out sort of how these processes all come together. But the OEIB board will see a final strategy paper for adoption at the next meeting, as well as sort of the next steps in the process in terms of how are we going to make sure that we're bringing the recommendations that the HEC are currently making, the recommendations our Learning Council are making, the recommendations that the field is making through our various subcommittees. Best Practices has heard several presentations on different pieces that could fit within this. And so kind of designing something where all of these various ideas come back to the Outcomes and Investment Subcommittee over the course of the summer, and then get created into a set of recommendations that would come to the board in the early fall. So beginning of a long process, and one hopefully that will have many points for engagement of these various groups, but ultimately result in something that's focused and honed and valuable to the governor as he then puts together his budget.
Any questions, comments from either HEC members or OEIB?
Are you looking for random ideas to contribute to the conversation?
Random ideas are great.
These are random, and probably nothing you guys haven't thought of already, but a couple things. We invested $75 million in the RFP process. And even though in a short period of time you don't get transformational change overnight, some of the RFPs are still in process. However, we have created a lot of very positive conversation and momentum in this state. You know, as an educator for 27 years, I can tell you, we've never had a laser focus, even knew the term 11 to 14. We never looked at 3 to 3. We never looked at prenatal. And as an educator, I didn't worry too much about oral health. Now I am. And I think that we have got positive momentum, and we have people and conversation going on, and we've seen that in RFP applications. So I think kind of the starting point to next year's budget is which ones have been successful? Where are we starting to get the flywheel to move a little bit? And I just would hate to not use the investment we just made going into the next biennium on the areas where people have just started to change practice, that we continue to invest. So maybe that's, that's what I'm throwing out, is a continuation of previous investment that's worked. Second thing, nothing becomes cultural change until it's in your general fund budget. And what's about ready to happen here in another month, or I'm sure this is true for higher ed, but I know the 197 K-12 districts, the rubber hits the road here in the budget committee in about a month. And what we're seeing is a little bit of change here in different conversations going on. So further incentivizing within the formula, if that makes sense. I know we have to increase that, but rather than just think a COLA increase and insurance increase, we think the current formula and how we do business in the budget process, we're going to have conversations on 11 and 14. Just two other things really quickly. We talked a lot about outcome-based budgeting, following outcomes, dollars following students. For this particular group, here's something we're talking about, the Eastern Promise. If Writing 121 is a 4-credit class and it's offered in the high school, what are the real costs of that and how do we pay for it? Meaning, you're using the ADMW from K-12. You're using partial FTE from higher ed. You're using a tiny bit of tuition offset. So what's the difference for that family? What's the real cost? What's the real analysis? We're doing that per credit, looking at that. So that may be a baby step outcome-based budgeting we look at, is focusing on 11 to 14. What are the weights? What are the costs when we have dual credit, credit by proficiency, whatever we want to call it? But when 121 is in the high school for those students, or a CTE pathway, Math 95, what's the real cost and how is it paid, and how's the formula going to support that? My final rant, I think the racks, Nancy, we talked about the potential for the racks. And this may be a way we also take a baby step in braiding cross-sector budgets. Okay? So this may be, when we start looking at outcome-based budgeting, a health budget, state budget, you have to contribute to your RAC goals. And if it's ready for kindergarten, if it's high school graduation, if it's workforce development, then you're part of your general fund budget, part of mine, part of DHS. If we incentivize that wraparound concept through the racks, a lot of rating of resources that might be a possibility. I'm done.
Thank you. Right, love it. And it comes to you on Friday, right?
Yeah, that's right. Won't get all the answers.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Scully. Whitney, on page 8, partway down, there's a highlighted need specifics. I don't know if you have the answers yourself, but that paragraph seems to intimate we were doing things perhaps in a misguided direction in the past. And in 2013-15, we yielded significant successes, it states, in terms of controlling those costs, turning them around. So what were those things that we were doing wrong as a state, where we were shifting resources out of the classroom, and then in 2013-15 we turned that around? What do you have specifics, or is that still to be collected?
So you hit upon, thank you, one of the spots where there's, Nancy said, sometimes you're not even finishing your sentences. Really, it's just sort of like an outline of what might go there, and taken from a different paper. But really the idea here is to talk about that we have made some steps in the 13-15 session through the legislatively approved budget at increasing education funding. So as you know, during the Great Recession, funding took a significant dip, and we began to build back a little in the last session. So that's really this conversation about that. In addition, controlling costs around the work that we're doing in healthcare, as well as the work around PERS.
So the phrase shifting resources out of the classroom simply meant when the legislative session ended, it was just the budget allocation that the legislature decided on went more to, for example, prisons, corrections, versus education? Or are you talking about inside education, we were doing things out of the classroom? Which one?
No, the first one. So that as a share of our general fund budget, we have been able to bend those cost curves somewhat and to shift money that was
which you address in the next paragraph, which is nice.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wendy.
Yes, I'm going to send this to you to finish reading it for me.
Might be some finished sentence.
Thank you for this. This was really helpful. In the equity lens that we created, we built in some language that the way that we spend our resources is an expression of our values. And I'm just curious if you spent any time, you may not have this yet, but we should think about it, and I'd love to hear back. So of the $75 million, do we have a sense of what proportion of those investments were made to specifically improve outcomes with children of color?
I'm going to look to Deputy Superintendent Saxon, who I think provided some information after the last meeting where you asked, but that might have been around a split between nonprofit organizations and school districts. Okay.
That's it. And I've been hearing that question over and over and over in every community that I've visited, and it usually followed with lots of opinions about how initiatives that are intended to benefit everyone don't always benefit everyone. So I've just been hearing that a lot, and I think it's a really important question for all of us to think about.
I agree. So perhaps we can task Superintendent Saxton with finding.
We can supply that shortly.
Okay, thanks.
Tim, did I see you? Did you? No? Anyone else? Okay, thank you, Whitney. More later.
Yes.
And then we have the college and career readiness definition.
Good
afternoon. I think I know all of you, but for the record, my name is Hilda Rosselli, and I serve as the Director for College and Career Readiness with Oregon Education Investment Board. And I am joined by one of my colleagues who was instrumental in this work, Lisa Reynolds, with the Community College and Workforce Development. And I realize that at this point in the afternoon, you have been sitting a long time and listening. So we're going to give some introductory remarks that give you some background about the development of this definition. And then we're going to engage you in a little scenario for just a few minutes, just to get your brain cells working in a different way. And then we'll debrief that and answer questions. And then we'll turn it over to Chair Yvonne Curtis from the Best Practices and Student Transition Subcommittee that has already reviewed and is making some recommendations to the OEIB relative to this definition. So I first of all want to thank and acknowledge a number of people, many of whom are in this room, who were critical in the development of the definition. We were very fortunate as we realized that we didn't really have a common understanding about what college and career readiness was. But there was this group, and it was funded through a grant. It was called Core to College, and they had already convened a group and begun to do some of the preliminary thinking and discussions about, well, what is this, and what are other states doing, and what would it look like here in Oregon? And so we were very fortunate to be able to build upon their work and expand the group and engage more people in this discussion. And about that time, we convened a college and career readiness cross-sector planning group. And that's a really long name, and I don't even try to do an acronym for it. But the purpose of that was that we knew that we were going to need the involvement of every agency in the development of goals and in the development of some policy frameworks that would help move this agenda so that all of our students really knew clearly what their pathway was towards college and career readiness. So as this group took on the responsibility of building upon, refining, and developing the statewide definition, they really emphasized the need to focus the definition to include both academic content knowledge as well as the habits of mind that students really need to be successful. And they wanted to make sure that this was not only thinking about, well, you're going to need this to be admitted to a post-secondary education program. They were also very deliberate about their focused attention on the skills that we need to be successful in jobs, in career advancement, and in life in general. So with that, one of the things that we did was to take our work and really focus on groups that we typically think of as having oversight for this important transition as students move from high school into post-secondary. We also used three primary sources for educating ourselves and discussing and looking at what was available. First off, published research. And secondly, we had the benefit of nationally recognized centers such as the Education Policy Improvement Center, headed by Dave Conley, who's done a lot of work in this area, as well as a careful analysis of what other states, some of whom were further along in this process, to see where they were. We then took it upon ourselves to meet individually. That sounds like we. I think several of us took on the responsibility of talking individually with some folks to make sure that, for example, the early learning division, someone might say, well, wait a minute, college and career readiness, they're probably not interested in that. Well, they were very interested in that, and they gave us some very productive thinking about that. We also spent time with Iris Bell with the Youth Development Division because she was really concerned about thinking about students who had exited high school who were going to be wanting to return into an education system. And so this definition needed to be broad enough for that group as well. We, of course, called upon our colleagues in the Department of Community College and Workforce Development, the Oregon University System, the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, and a very important addition, as you can see today, the Governor's Workforce Policy Advisor, Agnes Palazzo, who really connected us with the OEIB and all of the other work groups that were focused on employment. Each of these groups gave us critical feedback and lots of edits At some points, it felt like we were wordsmithing, my favorite activity. And then in late fall 2013, we really wanted to make sure that we reached out to gather more input. So we put together an online survey, and I was delighted that first of all, we were able to get participation and people distributing it through lots of different channels. People who are already sending out regular notices to folks added it to point out that this was an opportunity to give feedback. And we had well over 280 responses that came in. And when we looked at the diversity of that group, that really did include folks who are in the Head Start and child care areas, both in the K-12 sector, both as educators, as well as there were some staff members, and then of course some district administrators. We also had very good representation from our public community colleges, and our public universities, and our private universities. And then also, of course, the Workforce Development Division and some of those other agencies that I mentioned, like Youth Development Council and state government, etc. So with that, we really recognized that we wanted to make a definition that would be useful to a lot of different users. This was not going to be something that was so academically jargon that maybe some of us understood it and others were just shaking their heads or not paying attention to it. And so for that reason, we structured it in a way to hopefully make it easy to understand and to also break it into two parts. One would be a brief statement, and we looked at other states to kind of see how are you doing this, because Massachusetts spent, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of dollars in years trying to come up with a state definition, and they're still not quite finalized on it. And I think we did this on a budget of zero, and basically felt like we were able to make a clear statement that people would understand what we're trying to do, and then we provided some explanatory indicators. Those indicators are something that we're going to ask you now to bring to life. And so I'm going to do something that's so K-12, but I have also done it in higher ed. I'm just going to have you count off to 8.
1,
2, 3, 4, 5,
6,
7, 8.
1,
2,
3,
4,
5, 6,
7.
8,
1,
3,
4,
5,
7.
And we'll be 8. And that was our kindergarten readiness assessment. We did some numbers in about the same amount.
don't we have to recognize the
Yeah. So what we're going to ask you to do is you're going to assume the identity for just a few minutes of a character on here and select the numerical one that matches the number that you just said out loud. And then you immediately have a situation that you need to deal with. And so we're only going to give you a few minutes, like we might only give you 3 minutes. We'll tell you when 3 minutes is up. But you're going to rip off your second page because this is your toolkit. And this is your opportunity to be creative and resourceful and to circle any of these skills that you are going to bring to bear on your particular situation. All right? Is it clear? Anybody need the directions repeated? I think we're all ready to go. All right, go to it. Seth, do we have more? Extra? Thanks, Seth. Thanks a lot.
Circle the review, you're going to do that skill.
You guys from that scholar.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's all over. No.
I see some collaborative learning going on over there.
distracted me, actually.
I like the way that Ben's on task. She's doing elementary.
About 3 minutes, so we're going to give you 30 more seconds. All right, so what we'd like to do is just debrief for a moment, and you can lean over and kind of look at your next door neighbor's paper on this activity, because everybody had a different scenario, and so they may have selected different things than you did. But one of the things that we're interested in is, first of all, how many skills did you find yourself drawing upon? And probably you were banking that, no, I really want to make sure I'm surviving this challenge. So you may have even used them thinking, okay, I'm not sure, but I sure would like to have that in my toolkit. So how many of you circled more than 10 on the page? Okay, how about more than 15? And more than 20? All right, Nicole and Rob, great, excellent. And then what we'd really like you to do is to look at where those items that you circled were. Were they evenly split, or were they all on one column? Anybody want evenly split? Okay, Rob says evenly split. How many of you thought your circles were evenly distributed? Okay, and how many of you looked at your activity and went, oh, well, this feels like I'm already a student, or I'm moving into an academic realm, and maybe you found yourself using more of the skill sets on the left side. Okay, and some of you were dealing with more things that might be in a workforce environment. Did you find yourself equally distributed or leaning to one side or the other?
I needed life skills.
Say what?
I needed life skills.
Life skills, okay. And Frank, you were going to?
Equal.
Equal, all right. And so we recognize this is just a very short little scenario, but it did break up your afternoon a little bit. But our hope is threefold. One is that we've made clear the recognition that there are a wide array of skills that we bring to bear in our world, whether we are in post-secondary education or in careers or in a transition period moving towards one or the other. And we also realize that these skills can serve as an indicator that students are college and career ready. We're hopeful that this will begin to help us see, okay, what are students going to need when they exit? I mean, it isn't all about the Common Core state standards. We know some of these things are not necessarily currently even assessed in the Smarter Balance. And yet they're equally important. You just said you drew from both sides of the list. So we want to make sure that as we move forward, that we have a full array of, or a full complement of skills that are going to help students. And then the last piece that we hope that became clear for you is that although the knowledge and skills and applications of learning may be slightly different depending on the discipline field that you might be going into, somewhere we had some chemical engineer aspirants, didn't we? Anybody? Yeah, Mary? Okay? So there might have been some differences about the skills or the level of the skills, but there's really a lot more commonality than there are differences. And that was one of the realizations that our committee actually realized as they dug deeper into the literature and looked at other examples. So at this point, before we turn it over to Yvonne, Lisa and I are here to answer any questions that you have. If you have personal wordsmithing suggestions, I'm more than happy to collect your document and take that and bring that back and make sure that those edits are made. But what we're really interested in is substantial ahas, takeaways, or suggestions that you have at this point. And then we'd like to talk a little bit about how we envision using the definition. So first off, questions?
Any questions or comments on the definition?
Okay, that is one of the skills. How about let's talk a little bit about how we envision using this. Well, first of all, the development that's happening right now around everything that you heard today is going to point to the need for a very clear framework to show students where are you currently and where do you need to be in order to be college and career ready. So that's probably the primary use that a common definition will communicate. We also feel that many students do not yet even think about the necessity of being college and career ready. That's going to be a new vocabulary for them and for some of their families who may be going, that just sounds like another gobbledygook, and what we really need to know is, what's going to happen next week for my child. So the important task that remains for us next is to really figure out how to best communicate this definition. And we've been very fortunate to work with communication directors of all of the agencies, and we're going to tap some other groups to really help us be creative in thinking about different audiences and how to reach this particular message out to folks. I was so impressed with what Ramon was saying earlier and saying, we have to be thoughtful about, it isn't just translating it into language. We have to be sensitive about culture. We have to be sensitive about when employers use this term, how are they reinforcing to our young people that they too understand the same outcome that we're all moving towards. So those are two primary ways that we want to use this. Thirdly, the policy group, the cross-sector planning group, has already started to identify some policy decisions that are going to need to be made. And so as that work becomes more developed, we need something like an equity lens to use as a frame of reference. And so like the equity lens, we have brought this to you for an adoption at your next meeting based on whatever changes you see necessary, so that we have a common basis and a framework for making these decisions and going back to saying, how does that fit with what we said we value? So at this point, what I'd like to do is to turn it over to Chair Curtis and hear from her the recommendations that came out of our review of this with best practices and Student Transition Subcommittee.
So as Hilda mentioned, Best Practices and Student Transition Subcommittee took a look at this definition in our January meeting and felt that it was, first of all, the work was really well done, and we proposed that this is a great opportunity for OEIB members to play a crucial role in ensuring that we use a common definition of readiness and that it's communicated so that we ensure alignment in all of the comprehensive work that's going on in the post-secondary work and workforce readiness. Not only in ensuring the work, but also thinking about how we model the kind of cross-sector, inter-organizational commitments. So like with the equity lens, using definitions, and in schools we call it common language. I just had that conversation with high school teachers today. We find that where we have common language and we all share in understanding what that language means, that we can move forward on initiatives and we can actually do better things for kids because we all know where we're headed together. So we have 3 recommendations. One, first, is that the OEIB, we recommend that you do adopt the college and career readiness definition as proposed. And we recommend also that the college and career readiness cross-sector group work, that's a mouthful, work with a wide variety of parents to identify partners to identify ways to successfully communicate the definition and the indicators to multiple groups, students, parents, educators, employees, and other interested parties in a variety of languages, print, online forms, and that we distribute that widely. The third one is we recommend that the cross-sector group engage with students, parents, K-12 educators, post-secondary education providers, and employers to seek input on the development of a useful roadmap whereby we will create, using this definition, pathways and assessment systems that help students develop and demonstrate these indicators. So again, a clear definition, using it for all the work that we do to communicate so that we all know what it means when we're talking about it. We know what the indicators are, and that we further use the definition as we create the pathways and assessments that kids use and parents use for measuring their kids' progress. So those are the 3 recommendations from Best Practices Committee. Anybody on the committee want to add? Well, I heard you say you wanted us to vote on this next meeting.
Well, I think in keeping with the way the board is proceeding, we bring an idea, give you a chance to think deeply about it, and to raise any questions or concerns. You can contact us, and then it will come up at the next board meeting. Is that correct? Okay.
So this is yet another issue. I think we're talking about the first 20%. I'm curious, we've got the GED, we have college and career ready, we have the diploma, which have, Rob and I sat through all those hours and hours on the high school diploma. By definition, it was supposed to be a diploma that reflected college and career ready. That's what we called it. That's the college and career ready diploma. How would this be something you would apply to the diploma and the GED potentially to define what it means to be 100% of our volumes?
It certainly says
meeting these standards. Is that what we're saying? And if so, this is going to lead into those systems, and if so, how?
it's a good question, and in our discussions, one of the things that we felt was that our high school diploma had set us off on the right track, and by identifying essential skills had pointed out the importance of other kinds of things that people need to be successful, but we felt like this could boost that and move that agenda further along and be able to make sure that all of us were pointing towards a broader definition and expectation for students.
So I was just going to add that I think this is a great example exactly of the kind of conversation we ought to have for all the work that's going on in different areas where we come up with, here's what we think it should look like. And what is it, the same thing across each of these areas, right? So you're talking about essential skills, and we're talking about college and career readiness, but what are all those other sort of definitions or terms we would use for some kind of completion or success? And I think what we could do is see where do they line up. One of the things that I always think happens in the conversations is we talk about, well, let me just say, at least in my community, we always say, well, but not all kids can do these things. And then others will say, well, yes, they can. It just depends on what depth. And that was something that I think you illustrated through the activity, is that whether you're preparing for graduation or going on to college or careers, and depending on what careers we're talking about, you still need a variety of these skills. So I don't know that we have the answer yet to your question, but I think it gets us to the right conversation.
And it gives us a tool by which to make sure that whatever discussions come forward, that we all can go back and say, well, how does that fit? And, how does that align with where we're trying to go with the entire strategic plan towards college and career readiness, which is one of the reasons that we would envision that probably 6 months from now, we might be bringing you back a sort of a framework of a plan that brings all of those pieces together in one place to sort of say, here are the steps that we're taking towards that.
So Duncan, I have a question for you, Duncan. Are you seeing this maybe as an additional add-on to the diploma?
I don't know.
redundant
Well, I
or?
mean, remember the diploma has 3 broad elements. One are essential skills, reading, writing, math. It has a whole career-related, you know, that have a whole set of issues around problem solving, career exploration, and then it has the academic requirements. And again, at the time, it was conceived, I'm not saying it was, and there were 2 or 3 other essential skills we never got to that they're still there. But that was, at the time, the definition of what we thought was career in college and career ready. And by career, we meant ability to really not just get a job, but to be able to progress through a career with, you know, mobility with hope. And I mean, that was the definition. That's what that was. And Rob, we spent many months on that question of exactly a very challenging question. So my only issue is this is probably an improvement. I mean, I understand that there's no right answer to this question of what is college and career ready. It's obviously a very challenging task. I just wonder, I mean, since we did go through that, if we embed these ideas into the diploma, whether the board should take a look at that, I don't know. I'm just trying to understand.
Well, one of the things that would happen would be this, this particular definition might be how we introduce the concept to students and their families.
Sure.
Because right now, if you just ask somebody, they might go, oh, to graduate, I need to do X, Y, and Z. But it's more, it isn't about, well, what are the skills that I really need to acquire?
Right.
And so that's where we're trying to bring more clarity to that. I don't see this in any way doing anything but complementing a real movement towards where we had envisioned the diploma going.
And I do wonder if this isn't a broader definition over those, all the essential skills and college and career and all of the, I mean, the career-related learning, I forget what we call curls and curling.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if maybe we could just ask staff to consider this question and think about the alignment, because I do worry about lots of checklists being out in the world that parents and children and educators have to worry about. So just making sure there's some kind of integration and that it makes sense to people.
I'm so glad you mentioned checklists, because that's something we don't want.
Right.
And what we also talked about was the fact that we really think in today's visual world that we really need to think about having some very short vignettes. We have some funding that's not from OEIB, but it's through the grant that's finishing out. And we talked about working together with the workforce and also some of our other partners to develop very short clips that could be available where a student or a person is talking about how they're using a skill rather than, you know, a checklist approach. So really trying to think creatively about that, but not create an additional campaign. That was one of the best tips that the communication directors gave us, is don't add it on as something additional. Thread it right through, because every single group has these similar goals and they can see a way to link in. How are we contributing to that? How does our efforts align with that? So that will be our next step.
Any other comments, questions? All right. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, this reminds me so much of when we were working on the AAC and LEAP and stuff, and how do you thread it without making it a checklist? And it's almost like the campaign could be this ready, set, connect thing where students can see themselves moving in and out of this aspect, but it's more like a hologram where they're here and they get this and then they're there and they get that, and they're putting these back, you know, in their backpack of knowledge, the skill set that carries over and so many things that they do, much like your checklist here today. But it's not that separate and distinct, and once you check it off, you're done with it, and you never have to worry about it again, right? So I really appreciate the fact that you are so anti-check sheet, because it's something we definitely need to get away from.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, subcommittee reports. Yvonne, do you have anything else to report from your committee?
Just briefly share what we did today. We had a meeting this morning, and the members were briefed on the Division of Early Learning, by the Division of Early Learning staff, on the findings and lessons learned from the kindergarten readiness assessment. We also learned about ways in which several districts are already using the results to work with their partners and create strategic plans. They focused on the specific indicators indicated in the KRA and have developed venues where they're looking at the data together and identifying strategies they'll work on together. We also had 2 presentations from the COSA OASE group. Has formed 4 work groups, and the 2 we heard from today, one was on full-day kindergarten, and our key discussion focused on recommendations and survey results from 137 districts regarding the needs around facilities, curriculum, professional development, and the personnel needed to implement full-day kindergarten, but more importantly, the need for all school districts to move forward and implement as soon as possible, and that ought to be around quality. And so these are the areas where the recommendations came, were the areas that we need to focus on to ensure quality. The second report was from the work group called Reimagining Grades 9 through 14. They had a list of current barriers, suggested solutions, and we had a discussion about all the work that's going on in different groups about that and how we might link that together, so that we create pathways for students, but also pathways for us to overcome those barriers really quickly. And it was really sounded really helpful in that a lot of work is already happening there. So I know that Hilda will be linking up with that group and trying to link all the groups that are working on this for 14 years. Lastly, we received a report from Stanford Children on the perceptions of parents of elementary level ELL students on ELL program progress. And they made some very concise recommendations which probably don't require any resource to get done and could actually really happen in a pretty smooth way. I know some of those recommendations are going to be made to ODE, and some of them will be things that districts and schools could do in the way of reporting students' progress on ALPA and their proficiency levels, and then what parents need to do to help their kids at those levels. All of these findings are being used to frame our subcommittee's recommendations that we'll be bringing from best practices to the full OEIB. We'll focus on best practices that address barriers, specifically at the transitions, and that would move us forward on Oregon's 40-40-20 goal.
Thanks, Yvonne. Any questions, comments? Okay, I don't know if Dick is still on the phone or if Whitney, you're going to do a report.
Yes,
Oh, Dick.
can you hear me okay?
Your committee report. Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. So a little disappointed that we on the phone were able to play in your game, not game, I shouldn't say that, your assignment, but I did learn though that I need a full complement of skills to be a used car salesman, so that's good.
A used car salesman.
We met on February 28th, where the two things we discussed. My members now are Ron Saxon, Hannah Vanderleen, and Duncan Wise, and Pam Curtis, very docile group. They don't get excited very much. And two things that we discussed, Achievement Compact report and budget priorities. Nancy and Whitney shared with us the group report done by the staff regarding the implementation of the Achievement Compact. The report included a review of building concepts that shape the Achievement Compact, and I think you've all got a list of, and Nancy posted that on March 4th. The key recommendations of the Achievement Compact in general, as well as specific recommendations for K through 12 and higher education. The members of the committee offered specific feedback and recommendations, and those have been included where appropriate in the final version of the report. And of course, we've been hearing all day today on the agenda. And then the budget priorities, Nancy and Whitney shared with us a first draft of a documentation for the committee to consider to help frame the discussion regarding budget priorities for 2015-17 biennium. Duncan Wise shared from his experience the big picture of the state hire process and budget process, and offered a suggestion as how the OEIB could best develop and describe a framework of budgeting for outcomes that would get traction. There was a lively discussion on this topic, and some members question whether the OEIB is talking about real change or is just fiddling around on the margins. Others are concerned that there has not been sufficient process with key stakeholders, and of course we'll be discussing this as we go along. With respect to more fundamental changes, there was interest among the committee members to attend to some big picture changes, but also to go deep in some areas to be determined by the potential of alternate models. Some members believe that if this group does not articulate some bold and new thinking, then no one else will, and the OEIB staff will get back. The next version of this document includes some high-level concepts as well as some opportunities to go deep. I think the bottom line is, of course, everybody's anxious about the success of the 40-40-20, and it's going to take everybody in the boat rowing the same direction to increase those numbers. I know Whitney's there. Probably any questions at all that you can have? I won't tell you where I am, but it's really nice.
Well, the sun's shining here too, Dick. Any questions?
Well, I'm on my third Snapple. I could share with you some information. I know it's been quite long, but I would like to share with you that the baby caribou can run faster than its mother at 3 days old. That came off of my Snapple bottle cap.
All right, with that, thank you, Dick. We'll move on to Nicole, Equity and Partnerships.
I was going to counter with a caribou fact, but I don't want to make it a competition. So we met this morning, and we had an opportunity to welcome, it was actually Dave Martinez, who's our new partner from the OEIB team, who will be supporting us, and he's doing a phenomenal job getting us on track. We also welcome Ramon Ramirez, who will be representing the HEC on our committee. We had a lengthy discussion and orientation to sort of the process of special education. If you recall, one of our 3 policy focus areas will be to make some recommendations about overrepresentation in special education. And so we wanted to make sure that we had sort of a solid ground before we dive deeper into that work. And then we spent the remainder of our time working and thinking through our policy recommendations on out-of-school youth. And we're farthest along with our GED work. We still have a lot of work left to do on our work around aligning systems and our work on supporting successful models. We feel like we need to maybe take a step back and make sure that we're aligning any of our policy recommendations with the Oregon Department of Education as well, so we're not at cross purposes, but we hope to bring something to the full committee probably in May.
Thank you, Nicole. Any questions, comments? Okay, I don't believe there's anyone signed up for public testimony. If you want to check that, Seth. Nope. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank the commissioners from the HEC for joining us today, as well as our OEIB members. Hope we can do this again. Maybe we can join you for a meeting at some point. But thank you, and we're adjourned.